I think I'm set up. How to make sure I was getting set up. Rudy, you can stick around and find out. It's a discussion. It's a conversation, a little bit of a conversation today, and it's education. I'm trying to accomplish educating people and trying to accomplish ensuring that, well, for one thing, one of the reasons that I came to TikTok and one of the reasons that I was asked to come and do this by members of my communities is that there is a need for allies and accomplices in my area to be able to decolonize and find their own ancestry without appropriating other people's cultures. And so that's one of the main reasons that I'm here. Along those lines, when we're trying to decolonize without appropriating other people's culture, we have to recognize a few different things. And so I want to make sure that we talk about some of those things. And there's a lot of conversation in a lot of different groups in a lot of different areas about some of these subjects. And so I want to make sure that so I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I'm globally mixed, and I'm Indigenous, including to Turtle Island, including to a couple places not in the United States or in the Americas. For me, that it did work. Okay. I'm not sure if it really battles it though. Do I recognize what nations by nature are heavenly colonized? Okay, so I'm confused as what you mean by nature are heavily colonized. Can you not correct, but elaborate on that?
Okay, I should be connected now.
Yes, absolutely. Peace. Awesome. You're there, Sleepy. I see you. And I don't think in this you can actually, okay, so this is where the live match stuff comes in. So for this, if you are in Sleepy's live, if you can send Sleepy hearts or gifts. It is. I'm sorry. I've got to. So it's going to go here. I just had to make sure everything was set up before it went here.
You do realize I only have like a few thousand followers. You've got like 20,000 followers.
So yeah, but we're at a time. We're at a time though, love, when like I've only got 10 people in my lives, so it's not like and it's not about what it is. It's about the I wanted to pump us both up on the algorithm. It's not necessarily about who gets the gifts out of it. I just want to see the pump up on the algorithm for both of us, because the algorithm's been shitty.
I have somebody in my life.
Yay. So if you are a mutual with me and with Sleepy, if you would like to go over there, that would be really encouraged by me. Just because of the fact that, again, I'm not trying to like beat Sleepy in any of this. I'm just trying to pump up the algorithm for both of us. And so it's not about an actual battle. It's just more about like trying to pump up the algorithm for us. So please, if you're both of our friends and you're over here and they only have like one person in their life, go ahead and come on over to their live so that we can get a couple people in their live. Because really what it's about is we're both going to speak on some different subjects, and it's about pumping that up in the algorithm, pumping that up on the FYP. Let me go ahead and finish with what I was saying with I need to know, Rudy, what do you mean by nature or heavenly colonized? Because that indicates people being colonized because nature thinks that they should be, to me, and I don't think that that's where you're going, and so I want to make sure that I'm actually getting it right. Sub on my YouTube. Awesome. Okay, so
I've noticed that because I'm in a totally separate live, I actually can't see any of the comments in your live.
You can't, and I can't see any of the comments in your live either. So you'll have to read off anything that you're answering in your live, and I'll have to read off anything that I'm answering in my live. And honestly, and I will, if you are asking a question of Sleepy and you are in my live, if you want to go ahead and say, hey, for Sleepy or something like that, if it's anything having to do with the space or the specific things that Sleepy speaks about, I'll go ahead and read them off so Sleepy can hear them. And I don't know.
That'd be cool.
I haven't seen any comments for a minute, so I'm not sure if this person has tried to clarify, so I'm not sure. But the point of the thing behind me is about trying to understand that. So there's been a lot of discussion that is very needed about people trying to appropriate Indigenous heritage from different spaces to give them a right to talk over Indigenous people in the space that they're in, and that's completely unacceptable. There's also been a lot of talk about other people deciding who is and who isn't Indigenous to areas, not based on the indigeneity of those areas. And so that's a little bit of what we're discussing. Rash, no. The question is, do I recognize Black peoples as Indigenous to the Americas? And I'm not going to use the so-called because that implies that they're not. And to all my understanding, we use that terminology. So descendants from Africa are descendants are African, have African ancestry. All of our information shows that the Turtle Island Indigenous people are who we currently think the Turtle Island Indigenous people are, and they're currently fighting against, colonization. So, and this might not work, Sleepy. If it doesn't seem to be working, we'll just pop you. We can just do it in the same live. You're right, they're not crayons. And the word black doesn't even really apply to skin color. We're all shades of brown. Nobody is a shade of black or actually white. Like nobody actually is physically like paper, and nobody is actually physically like black. Until we address what? Black is dead in the eyes of the law until we address what? Yeah, this might not work like this. Do you have anybody over there, Sleepy?
I have got one person over here.
Okay. We can pop it down and you can come on over here if you think it'll be better. I was trying to experiment and see if it actually did anything, but if it's not actually doing anything, then we can pop it.
Yeah, I don't mind. It means I'll be able to see the comments and stuff your way as well.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do that, and I'll just invite you up when you come on in.
Okie dokie, I'll do that now. All right, I'll see you in a second.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sleepy's mic is probably picking up a ton of noise because they've got a baby in the background, and it will probably be better once they're in here in a different way.
Okie dokie.
Okay, so please explain what you mean by what you mean by until we address what? Whether or not people of African descent are indigenous to the Turtle Islands, or whether or not, hi Mia, whether or not, I'm not sure what we're addressing. So yes, the statement is black and white refers to a static example. Free white person was once referred to by the so-called blacks. Was once referred to the so-called blacks. What you mean by that is the fact that Italians. Sorry, my live paused. What you mean by that is the fact that Italians and Irish were once referred to as being black in the United States. In the United States, and we need to specify in the United States, not across the globe, right? And this is absolutely correct. And that's why we have Columbus Days, because the Italians decided that they needed to be higher up, and in needing to be higher up, they brought their hero in, right? So yes, there is problems with that, but those problems don't exist anymore. There are also many Turtle Island Indigenous people who are called black in censuses and things like that as well. And absolutely will include stolen people with valid Indigenous ancestry. Let me see. Okay, so won't it let me see if I can, it won't let me like, absolutely. Absolutely, we have to deal with the real history before we can move forward. Why isn't it not? Sorry, YouTube, for 1 second. The camera is going to be a little bit weird. I've got to take it off of my phone so I can figure out why I cannot actually get sleepy up here. Um, fuck off. What is wrong? Oh, I can't wait to see what you're beating. Oh my God. Odin Skoden had a live yesterday for their top surgery, and had so many beautiful earrings done by so many different people. It was like, I've got some, but I haven't beat it in so long. So let me see. I don't know why it's not letting me. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to figure out why I can't actually invite Sleepy up at this point. I'm so bad at TikTok. So the indigenous people to Turtle Island, though I need to specify. So what we're talking about today isn't necessarily indigenous groups that are recognized as indigenous groups already by the UN. We are going to talk a little bit about the differences, right? Being recognized and being unrecognized, what indigenous actually means, right? But we're not specifically speaking on indigenous groups that are already recognized by the UN today. We speak about that sometimes, but not today. The indigenous people to Turtle Island are the ones that all evidence shows are the indigenous people to Turtle Island. They come in many different nations, many different peoples. My ancestors come from the Miwok and from the Cherokee. Some are registered underneath the Quapaw registration, which is usually people from many different groups who are registered under Quapaw. And I grew up among the Haida. These are all Turtle Island Indigenous groups that are recognized as Turtle Island Indigenous groups, and they are the Indigenous groups of Turtle Island. I can, using things like GED match and my DNA, show that my DNA connects me to a Clovis find that we have and to Kennewick man, right? Most people who are Turtle Island Indigenous can connect their DNA, or not that many of them do DNA, or connect their family lines and their history, or have like legitimate like family lines that they can name out to the 10th ancestor, right? Here in the Turtle Islands. These are people who are indigenous to the Turtle Islands. And yes, many people were misclassified as being Black who were Turtle Island Indigenous. That does not mean that people who are currently what is considered Black in the United States are Turtle Island Indigenous. They are indigenous to Africa. So everybody, I'm going to, maybe if I pause it, let me see if I can pause it first. Nope, it won't let me. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off and back on. I'll be back in like 3 minutes. It'll just take me to turn off and back off. Rash, that's incorrect. That's just factually incorrect. How you can say, yeah, it's not letting me. How you can say that my DNA connecting to people who were here 12,000 years ago does not indicate that my ancestors were actually indigenous to the Turtle Islands, when people who are Blacks, DNA does not connect to people who were here 12,000 years ago, but people who are called Black within the United States, DNA actually connects to people in Africa, is problematic. Have you done your DNA and actually connected? Have you been able to see where your DNA actually connects to pre-colonized finds here in the Turtle Islands? So then you are indigenous, you're not African descent, or you're a combination of both. Afro-Indigenous exists. People who are both Black and Indigenous exist. But that does not mean that everybody who is considered Black within the United States is Afro-Indigenous. And it does not mean that anybody considered Black within the United States is automatically Indigenous to the United States. I'll be right back. I'm going to stop the live and I'm going to restart it. Maybe TikTok is giving me all sorts of problems. Maybe TikTok doesn't want to do anything I want it to do today. Okay, let's try turning you off. Let's try.
Last year, this ended up.
There we go. Okay, I invited Sleepy. There we go. Perfect. That works. Hey. Okay. So that works much better. I don't know why the other one wasn't working and it wouldn't let me. I'll wait a few minutes just so we can make sure.
Hi,
And
Mia.
you can also see the comments this way, which you couldn't before, which was frustrating. Still trying to make sure everything is set up. Give me 2 seconds. Okay. My YouTube camera is being a total pain in the fucking ass. Okay.
How is my background noise now? Is it okay?
I think so. It wasn't really problematic to me. Personally, I think we should, background noise happens for everybody. I do still hear like there's like a cartoon or something for bear going on in the background, which is totally acceptable, I personally think. Just because of the fact that you've got to entertain your child, right?
Well, yes, unless we want a child climbing all over me.
Right. Bear is a great person, but I'm not sure he's going to add a lot to this conversation. He might actually make it very frustrating for you, right? He might add a lot as a child, but so yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mia. What I want to address today and what I want to talk on today, yes, there are groups of stolen people, and yes, there are groups of people who have been displaced, and we'll probably speak on those a little bit. But I want to talk about some of people's struggles for being recognized as Indigenous people. There's a lot of people around the globe who are still by all names Indigenous, like by all of these, and this is the UN. This down here is what the UN tags as what Indigenous people are. This is the UN's verbiage on it. And so there are still people across the globe who are struggling to be recognized by the UN who fit all of these things. The UN recognizes that there are something like 5,000 groups of Indigenous peoples in 90 countries around the globe. And for reference, we have 195 countries around the globe. So out of the 195 countries that we have around the globe, 90 of those countries have recognized Indigenous groups within them. And so we need to acknowledge that there are Indigenous groups around the globe that are still fighting to maintain their space and their indigeneity. And also recognize, in my opinion, that there are groups who are still fighting to be recognized as Indigenous that fit all of the things, and understand that No colonizer is going to give you the armor to fight against them. No colonizer is going to name you Indigenous so that you can have rights against them, right? So when we have Indigenous groups who are currently fighting against colonization or against for recognition and against colonization in their areas, we are looking at Indigenous groups whether or not they're recognized by the UN. The UN is not the be all and end all, right? Because there's a lot of problem with it. I also want to double down, and I'm just trying to get some of this stuff out of the way in the beginning, and we'll talk about all of it again in different spaces. But I also want to double down that whether or not you are a member of a recognized Indigenous group, or whether or not you are fighting to be a member of Indigenous, to be recognized as an Indigenous group, none of these recognizations should be used as a white supremacist talking point. None of these recognizations or understandings should be used to overtalk people who are currently fighting against indigenation or against colonization. And in many spaces, we find that the colonization that Europe did across the globe puts white supremacy as a forefront and white people as a forefront. So if you are an Indigenous group who happens to be of lighter skin or happens to be from a European area, when those European areas colonized darker skinned groups, it is very important, and most Indigenous groups I know actually follow this thought process, to not talk over other Indigenous groups about their space, right? To not sit there and Sleepy is Kumri. They would never talk over somebody who was of a darker skin indigeneity here in the Turtle Islands, right? They would never try and decide that their experience is more important, center themselves in somebody else's experience. All of these things can be met. All of these things can be understood together without erasing anybody and without enacting the white supremacist talking points that so many people have across the globe. That is what I want to do with today's live overall. But that's just an overview. So we'll have a lot of different things that we're talking about. That's just the basis of it. The Uyghurs, yes. And the Uyghurs are actually a recognized group. Trying to find a list of who is recognized by the UN, though, is impossible. I spent like 5 hours trying to find who is recognized by the UN and who is not. This is true. And this is true, yeah.
Is that me?
It might be. But it's okay. There's a small child to entertain, and so we absolutely support it, because it's definitely better to entertain the small child than it is to have the small child in our face. Hey, Fable. Resemblance doesn't mean anything. And so modern Native Americans closely resemble people of China, Korea, and Japan. So the DNA proves that modern Native Americans aren't related to any of those people. Like, that's what the DNA says.
If you want to talk about areas of China, there are some cultures in some of the outskirts of China that their cultures closer resemble Celtic culture than they do actual Chinese culture. So culture itself is something to consider when we're talking about these things.
100%. Well, and if you look at the Ainu people of Japan, they are actually pretty light skinned and have more European eye shape than most people in Japan, right? Ras, that's not true either. I'm an archaeologist and a paleoanthropologist, and I've put a lot of study into this, and what you're saying is incorrect. So Turtle Island Indigenous people actually have unique DNA. The unique DNA is a ghost species in Turtle Island Indigenous people that's not seen anywhere else in the globe, including any of those groups you just mentioned. And all of those groups do not have Denisovan DNA, which Turtle Island Indigenous people also have Denisovan DNA. And nobody from northern Eurasia has Denisovan DNA. The only people that have Denisovan DNA on the Eurasian continent are in the southwest or southeast of the Eurasian continent. So none of those groups. Well, maybe Korea, because Korea is in the southeast, isn't it? My geography is bad. But none of those groups have the ghost tribe the ghost species that is seen in Turtle Island Indigenous groups. So again, what we're looking at today is not what recognized Indigenous groups are within the UN. There are many Indigenous groups recognized within the UN. What we're looking at today is the differences of being recognized and being unrecognized, and some of the fights and some of the struggles that people are taking to be recognized. Turtle Island is the name that several nations along the eastern seaboard of the United States and Canada use to refer to the entirety of North America. There are people in Iceland who have DNA from Indigenous people in the North Americas. It's a mitochondrial DNA that they got most likely from that connection when Icelanders were here in North America. How that got there, you know. So Ras, you don't have a lot of facts that you're bringing in, and most of what you're bringing in has been disproven. So I'm going to ask you to kind of stop and back up. I'm going to ask you to listen, because you're not here to speak. You're here to listen. And I'm going to ask you to, you know, stop coming up with facts that aren't true, right? Good. Do it somewhere else. Go find your own life to do it in. Okay. I believe that, Fable. I believe that, Fable. So when we're looking at what Indigenous means, this list behind us is really important. So most importantly, they self-identify as Indigenous people. There is a historical link with those who inhabited a country or region at the time when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrive. They have a strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources. They have distinct social, economic, or political systems. Probably not. I'm going to go ahead and read it off. They have distinct social, economic, or political systems. They have a distinct language, culture, or belief. They are marginalized and discriminated against by the state. They maintain and develop their ancestral environments. Bad Karma, are you talking to me or are you talking to Ras? I'm a little bit confused and I want to make sure. They are marginalized and discriminated against by the state, and they maintain and develop their ancestral environments and system as distinct peoples. Now, some of these things don't happen. Like when we look at they maintain and develop their ancestral environments and systems as distinct people, many people are actually displaced. And so they do not have the ability to maintain their ancestral environment, but they are maintaining the environment that they're currently in. So when we're looking at groups that are fighting to be recognized, when we look at this list, what we see with that fight to be recognized is that many people fit on this list of what Indigenous is, but are still not being recognized. When we look at that, we see that it's important to understand and recognize that people's fight to be recognized is very important, right? And acknowledging people's fight to be recognized. When we're erasing other people's fights to be recognized, we're basically erasing people's struggling what they're going through. There was a lot of debate recently. Currently, the only recognized by the UN group of Indigenous people in the northwest of Eurasia is the Sami. And they are absolutely an Indigenous group. They are absolutely the Indigenous group in their area. Fable was really amazing in a comment that I saw that they stated, you know, that the Sami are the Indigenous, but the Scandinavians are Native, and that there is a distinction made within the UN between what Indigenous and Native means. And so that's a pretty important understanding too. Part of that distinction really comes from recognizing that people are maintaining their Indigenous heritage too. And so when we're looking at different groups, we do see that there are, I think it's 3 or 4 groups. I'm going to say 3 right now. Groups within Great Britain, or what Great Britain distinguishes itself as, on the British Isles, that are actually fighting to be recognized as Indigenous. And we should understand those fights and honor those fights. The Cymru, where Sleepy is from and who Sleepy is a part of, Cymru, right? Is that right?
Khmer, yes.
Okay. Actually, I mean, I've seen a lot of marches and a lot of action to fight for that recognition that they're going through right now. Um, and this also involves a lot of struggle to retain and regain different elements of culture that they are going through. And that is really important to acknowledge, that struggle to maintain that connection, and that struggle to regain that connection is really important. And that's why I've invited Sleepy up to talk. We've talked before about what it means to be a part of those cultures, and Sleepy's come in and spoken about that. So I'm going to ask so that I actually give like a, something for you to speak off of. Um, for the Khmer, is, what are some of the ways that the Khmer are actually fighting for recognition today?
So the biggest fight really is the independence movement. So people outside of the UK may or may not have heard of various parts of the UK trying to fight for independence. The biggest movement that most people are aware of is the Scottish movement for independence. That's gained a lot more traction. The last vote for independence they had, I think, in 2016, they lost the national vote by a very, very fine margin. They're now fighting for another Indie referendum based on the fact that they were dragged out of the EU against their will. Politically, everything has changed since then, and they believe that this once-in-a-lifetime vote should be recognised as another chance because it's gained a lot of movement. Now, on the quieter side, you do have the Welsh independence movement, which is the Cymru movement. And it's a very similar kind of movement, but it's also a very different thing. So Scotland joins the UK as part of the Acts of Union written into law with the Parliament here in the UK, and they technically signed into the UK, whereas Wales never did that. Wales was and is the first colony of England. We were forcibly taken. And we were annexed officially to England during the reign of Henry VIII. We never signed anything into joining. We just had our lands basically forcibly taken. And throughout modern history and ancient history, from the beginning of like written history, we have had parts of our culture whittled away, and particularly, in the last few hundred years, there's been a huge attack on language during like the early 1900s, all the way through to the 1970s. It was technically illegal to speak our own native language. In schools, they actually actively removed a lot of our own teachers because the language was demonized and specifically stated as being the cause of the backwards issues of the people of Cymru. So they replaced all of our teachers with proper English school teachers, and they implemented tactics like the Celtic knot, which is basically a wooden placard that they would hang around the neck of children speaking Cymraeg in school, which is their native tongue, and essentially the child with this placard hanging around their neck at the end of the school day would be severely punished. I think the standard punish was like 6 canes in front of everybody. So this not only encouraged people not to speak their own language, but it also encouraged the children to tell tales on another child doing it because they didn't want it around their neck. It actively basically started making people of Cymru despise their own language and despise their own culture because it was demonized. So the movement here, it's changed quite a lot politically in the last few years. We can only go off of rough polls and things. It used to be a case of it was, I think, 30% wanted to leave and 50% wanted to stay, and 20% were unsure. now it has moved to more of 40% want to stay, 40% want to leave, and 20% want to are unsure. So the interesting thing about that movement is it's not been taken from the unsure people. The people that now want to leave that didn't want to leave before will firmly remain. And this has been fueled by a lot of the incidences that are going on in Westminster that are designed to be very Anglo-centric, to basically create policies that benefit England and England only. The political system here in the UK seems on the outside to be quite a fair system. You have a certain MP that represents a certain amount of individuals in a specific area. So, you know, that seems like it's fair, but England have 85% of the population. So they also have 85% of the MPs, the members of parliament here, which means that even if there was a policy being brought into play that Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales did not want, but England voted for it, it would be done against the will of the people from the other countries. And one of the biggest examples you can give of this is there was a monoglot village within Wales. Now, monoglot basically means a place where the native language was either the first or the only language spoken in that community. And it was, I think, the last monoglot community within Wales. And I think this is in 1967 or 68. And the members of parliament decided that they needed more water for industry in Liverpool, which is in the north west part of England, relatively close to the Welsh border. So they decided to flood this village and create a dam, which they decided to hold a vote on this. And of course, every single MP from Wales are like, no, you can't do this. This is people's homes. There were families, there were schools, there were, you know, farmland, there was churches. But every single one of the English MPs voted for it, and they did exactly that. They displaced an entire monoglot village to use their village, flood it, for water and industry. Now, the bit of the dagger to it is they never actually used it. They just did it, and then it was never put into any kind of use. So Westminster doesn't work for everyone. It only works for the people it's designed to work for. All of our natural resources are pilfered to England. So, for instance, we have one of the best water supplies, aside from Scotland. We have one of the best water supplies, and we supply a lot of water to England. We're also the 5th largest energy supplier in the world. Yet we don't see profits from that because it's taken as part of being in the UK, or it's owned by private companies. So, thank you. Nice. So we do face a lot of modern issues. Please don't. You want me to open it? 2 seconds.
While they're doing that, I'm going to address something. I am Turtle Island Indigenous. So some of these comments need to kind of take a step back. I'm a Turtle Island Indigenous human being. I'm speaking on Indigenous issues in different spaces around the globe. Many Turtle Island Indigenous people that I know actually want to hear about how other Indigenous people are faring, and other Indigenous people are still struggling against colonization here and there, because in the understanding that that there are many different groups who are Indigenous still fighting against being marginalized or colonized, we can further that movement for land back, further that movement for returning space to Indigenous. I know that my usually it's pretty. Let me see. You're more than welcome to go ahead and speak again, Sleepy.
Okay, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
I'm sorry. One thing.
That's okay. It's not a problem.
One thing that's struck me when we were talking before was the fact that for the community, you guys not only had your language removed from school, but they don't teach Khmer history in your school. They teach African history, and they teach American history, but they don't teach actually Khmer history in your school. Like, there's no, understanding of that.
Sorry, I missed half of that because you froze for a second, but I caught the end of it.
Okay.
So it's only oh, sorry,
Go
carry
ahead.
on.
One thing that we had talked about before that you had mentioned in one of our conversations before was that they currently don't teach Khmer history in your guys' schools. They teach history of other groups that have been colonized by the English, but not the Khmer.
So they've now recently changed that. I think it was either the end of last year or the beginning of this year. The Welsh government, which does have some devolved powers, we have devolution and full control over education and things like our NHS healthcare systems, but we have no control over like criminal law or things like that. So they did vote to change this, but originally the vote was held to teach about Black history and or Welsh history, and they actually chose to teach about Black history first. Which I'm not saying that is not something important to teach. It's absolutely important to teach that, and it's very important to teach the Cymru's involvement in that as well. Just because we have at some point been colonized in our history or continue to be colonized doesn't mean that we also can't be the aggressors in those stories. And that's a very important thing to add. No. So, and because Wales was classed as, or is classed as, part of Britain, and we are classed as British, even though most of us despise that term because it's so Anglo-centric, we have to take responsibility for what we as Britons did do. But when it comes to learning about our own histories, essentially it wasn't considered relevant to teach us about our own histories, because why would people who essentially control all of our economic, livelihood and everything about our country want us to know exactly how oppressed our people were? It would be handing us power. It's only recently that has changed, and I don't know when they're going to start introducing that curriculum, but my son's in nursery. He goes to reception, which is the first official year of school here, in September, and I'm hoping that he'll start to see some of the benefits of that.
Yeah, I think that that's huge. I know for me, when you had talked about it, and I'm really glad that they changed that. It really struck because I know here in the Turtle Islands, we don't learn about Turtle Island Indigenous history in school. We learn about so much history, but the Turtle Island Indigenous history that we get is heavily, as well as the slave Indigenous, or the slave history that we get, the African American Indigenous history that we get, or not Indigenous, but history that we get is so twisted. But when we look at it, we're seeing history that is very much whitewashed, very much perverted, very much not teaching the truth. Like in the South right now, they're teaching that people volunteered to come here from Africa for a new life, and that basically they worked so that they could achieve a new life, instead of teaching about the transatlantic slave trade. And they don't teach at all about the truth about Indigenous history. We learned that Thanksgiving was this joyous feast and not the massacre that it was, right? No, we can't pin.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
In terms of stuff that I particularly learned at school, history here in the UK or in English schools or Welsh schools is so very different, I think, than perhaps what it is in the US. I understand that the US learn a lot about US history, or what they want them to know about US history. To a certain degree, you can say that about Britain, but we don't barely learn anything about the US, because as much as a lot of US people I know would be like, haha, you're British, we beat you in the war, Britain doesn't really care. Or at least they play it off that they don't care. Our history is so much vaster, just in terms of written history. There is so much more to learn than just about American history, which is just a drop of the history available over here. We didn't particularly learn about American history. The most education I had on Indigenous to Turtle Island history was really not the best, because it was probably from old cowboy and Indian movies, which are very, very problematic. And even up until now, in some places, you will still see people throwing cowboy and Indian parties, which is horrific. We don't have the education surrounding Indigenous to Turtle Island people. But in many ways, it's considered irrelevant to our lives because we see lives through the lens that we live. So it's not that people don't care, it's just that they are truly ignorant to it. And the same comes when it comes to like Black history. I didn't really appreciate, until I got much older, the difficulties that some of my friends, who I had a lot of Black and brown friends when I was growing up in like primary school and high school, I didn't really appreciate until I was much older the worries that some of them had to face that I never had to worry about. Now, I'm not going to say that the racism culture here is exactly the same as the US, because I think that there are nuances that need to be understood, that people don't walk around here calling themselves, African American because A, we're not American. They may describe themselves as Black British. It's a very different identity over here. Now, that's not really for me to speak on and say exactly how they identify themselves or whatever. And there is very much a lot of racism that still exists over here. But from my understanding, and again, my understanding is only going to be from my lens, it is very different to the lens that is presented to me through TikTok of the people living in America.
Absolutely. T-Bones, so I don't usually hold discussion chats, and this is a little bit less of a discussion chat. And we're also not focusing on recognized. So there is a lot of discussion right now about who are Indigenous peoples and who are not. And a lot of that discussion focuses on who the UN names as being Indigenous people and who the UN says is not Indigenous people. There are many groups out there that follow everything or not follow, but are everything in the list, or the vast majority of what the UN, which is this below, states as Indigenous people, who the UN is refusing to acknowledge and recognize. And a lot of that refusal to acknowledge and recognize has to do with that belief that they'll lose control. And if they lose control, that colonization that those people are going through, they lose control of the resources, they lose control of the people. And we're looking at different spaces and the different colonization that they went through as an awareness, as an understanding of struggles and troubles outside of the U.S. and Canada, U.S. and Canada. And so we're looking at a more global perspective so that we can bring some of that global perspective into people who are coming from this space and this school system often don't get an understanding of what is going on across the globe. Usually this is not my focus. Usually my focus is teaching paleoanthropology, and I often hold space for Turtle Island Indigenous people, especially, dealing with a lot of different things that we're going through. And you're welcome to come up. I don't know you, and that's another thing. I don't really invite people into my boxes that I don't know. It is a safety thing for me, and so there's a lot with that. I'm more than willing to invite you up if you, with the understanding of what we're trying to discuss. I totally always hold space, and we've had many discussions and conversations about what we're going through. ICWA, MMIW, and the problems that we face. There is, for many Americans who want to either use the idea of being Indigenous as a white supremacist tactic, well, I'm Nordic Indigenous, or erase Indigenous groups that are currently existing outside of the US and Canada. And that's what we're trying to bring in today. And if you want to come up and discuss that, more than welcome and more than wanted. Again, I'm really, really usually iffy about people that I don't know, because I have a lot of safety issues for online, and I have a lot of safety issues with males. So underneath that, you're more than welcome to come up. If you would still like to come up.
There was a comment about where's their enrollment number.
Yeah, and I never claimed to be enrolled. And if you're going by enrollment or blood quantum, then we're not going to have a whole lot of conversation, because that's white supremacist bullshit talking points, and I don't deal with them. That's the government trying to decide who is Indigenous and who is not. If you want my if you want my protocol, if you want me to tell you who I am, I'm more than happy to tell you who I am. But I'm not enrolled. I never seek enrollment. I don't seek enrollment because I feel like I've already got plenty of armor. I don't need the armor of enrollment. Okay. And for me to take from people who don't have this armor would be extremely inappropriate and extremely anti-Indigenous. And so I don't enroll and I don't seek recognition as Turtle Island Indigenous or anything along those lines. Absolutely. And I have been as well. Like, I was raised within the Haida community within the Pacific Northwest. Okay. And I won't give my second mother's name out loud here on TikTok for everybody because I'm very anti-doxing. But I can give you the fact that my grandmother Polly was Miwok and her children and grandchildren were registered Quapaw, the Spring family, and that my grandmother Nani was Red Paint Clan Eastern Band Cherokee. I do not claim being connected to either of those spaces or any of those three spaces because I haven't. I'm not going to seek rights from that connection. That's not appropriate to me. So, Northern Scald is Sami, and a very good, beautiful human being friend of mine. Well, I shared my grandmother's, like, not like now. So, but yeah, I don't share family names usually. In fact, I think that's the first time I've said the Quapaw family online because I just don't do that usually. And that was because I was a little hyped up. I'm going to open up a little bit more. Oh, absolutely. But again, under that understanding that we're giving a lot of priority today to, the understanding of how people are going through fighting for it in other spaces because we, looking at those other spaces. My love. I did accept. Much love, T-Bones, and I will have it open to Turtle Island Indigenous groups frequently. And next time, and I'll follow you so that you can. Oh, maybe I will. My internet seems to be shitty.
Want people checking you right now while you're in the middle of teaching class and disturbing your lesson. I hope you don't mind me coming up here. Listen, Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we come in a lot of different colors. She is not debating that right now. She's trying to teach a class about somewhere else. And regarding that indigeneity, as far as her indigeneity goes, she is spitting facts. And she should not have to prostrate herself nor dox herself to you. She doesn't owe that to you. You are not the all holy decider on who is Indigenous enough. Okay? Don't even give them that leverage. That is absolutely freaking ridiculous.
You're right.
I've shown my tribal ID on here. 3 of my grandparents were 100% Indigenous, and that does not matter because if you come from any Indigenous ancestry to Turtle Island, you're Indigenous, and this is absolutely ridiculous to judge by phenotype. I am Pawnee. I am maybe a shade darker than the chief of my tribe. So you guys, that is currently chief. So you can shut up. Stop it. People don't have to dox themselves to you. They don't owe it. All right? She's just trying to teach a lesson about something that's going on overseas, and it may parallel with some of the shit that we're going through. So shut up, take notes, and listen. All right? Jeez. All right.
Thank you
Please
so
finish
much.
your class.
Thank you so much, my love.
Thank you.
And thank you for that reminder. I often forget that reminder that I do not have to dox myself, especially, having gone through so many of the things that I've gone through. Doxing myself is so uncomfortable. So every time I do it, like, I almost hyperventilate doing it. So thank you for that reminder. I do want to say that we have to understand Indigenous people's fights across the globe for land back to work anywhere. Land back must work everywhere for land back to work anywhere. And for land back to work everywhere means the saving of our species in a time when Western thought and Western agriculture is killing us. And the return to Indigenous practice is really the only thing I personally believe that has any chance of saving us as a species. Land back must work everywhere for it to work anywhere. And that is why I look at this as a global scale and not just a Turtle Island scale. Northern Scald, again, is a very good friend of mine, beautiful human being, saw me. Please go ahead, your turn.
Yes, so, thank you. I was actually what you were talking about earlier that really got me into, like, I gotta come on because I saw when I go by. And now, when I was listening to you now talking about other places and other problems and issues that's going on right now, like we have a lot here. And to go back for it, we have a lot of people, for example, who have problems who don't who have who have difficulties to difference between being native and being indigenous here in Scandinavia, or what that means, for example, or here in Europe, for what that means. For example, a Swede, for example, can be native or is native, and a Norwegian is native, a Dane is native, a Finnish person is native, but the Sami people, they are indigenous, right? Because with the Sami people, we have existed. We came approximately the same time, but the Sami came from the north, and the Germanic tribes came from the well, like we met in the middle, basically.
Can I pause you 1 second?
But what
Sleepy,
happened was,
if you mute your mic while you're not talking, it will lower some of the back. You don't have to take your picture off, but if you mute your mic, perfect. Thank you. Much love. I'm so sorry. Go ahead. It's called.
Yeah. So no worries. So what happened there basically is that a lot of people sees the things that, oh, but they were here at the same time. Why aren't they indigenous? Why aren't they indigenous? Why aren't Swedes indigenous? Why aren't Norwegians indigenous? It's because they are the majority population, right? Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, they are the majority of the population. They basically created the countries. They were the boundary setters. You know, they created the borders, for example, and all that. So they were the one that created the official countries, right? And without, if the roles were different, for example, if for some reason somehow the Sami people, and I know I went through this a couple months back on my channel. If the Sami would have been the majority population, for example, it would have looked very different in a specific way, right? And the Swedish area would maybe be like this big, basically on the map. And so the thing is here is that who is regards of being indigenous and being native, for example, it is in European perspective or the human perspective, it is based on being around before a country was like basically were created. You have a different culture, language, culture overall, and you would basically be also have a form, just also have existed there. Again, this is really important. You have to have existed there long before the country were basically created. And that is the difference of being indigenous and being native for them. But if you're going to take it into perspective, for example, the society that developed faster were the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, for example. They were the one that got with time, right? So they were also the countries that developed faster and modernized faster, while the Sami indigenous people, they still lived their traditions, their culture, their ways for a very long time, up until the 1800s, when the states and the churches decided to colonize and Christianize the Sami territories. And for a long time after that, we were not seen as humans. We were not seen as anything, basically. A lot of things were just, forbidden. They were banned. A lot of things was just removed from us. We weren't able to speak our language. We weren't able to yoik. We weren't able to have our gakdis, and so on. And that for us is still today. It comes back basically, and we have it reborn each and every day. And that is also why it's so important to be able to separate the indigenous side from the native side, basically, to show that we are the indigenous people. We are still here today. We have our culture and traditions, but we are taking it back, basically. And there's a lot of us who don't really want to out themselves or come out as Sami because of the years and years and years of persecution and being hunted and being all that. So there's a lot of things going on in our communities even today that have it harder for the Sami people to be accepted as indigenous here. Yeah. I'm sorry if it was all over the place here.
Don't be sorry at all. That was really so. In America, it's hard for us to understand the difference between indigenous and native because in the United States, what we were calling Native American for a couple hundred of years actually only recently are referred to widely as indigenous versus Native American. It's really because of that taking back of sovereignty and taking back of how we refer to be spoken of. And it's also, to us, it seems to mean the same thing. And it's important to recognize that it is not the same thing to everybody. And I really enjoy that. Fable had spoken the other day in the video that I had done off of the girl talking about closed Nordic practices. Had spoken up and said that. And I think that's an extremely important point. And I thank you very much for bringing that point in from a Sami perspective, right? From a person who actually lives in the middle of that experience perspective. Thank you so very much for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I was actually going to touch on that as well, on that, because I was going to go in on that, for example, because that is what she was doing and what she's doing is really harmful. Because she was basically just erasing the entire Sami existence, the entire Sami struggle, the entirety of our struggles, both back and all the way up to today, to modern time. So it is a lot. It was a lot to even try and make videos of that without actually losing my mind while doing it.
It's a lot of labor.
Yeah. So yeah, and give me a second. And Shell, you have Swedish ancestry. How would I prove Sami heritage? Well, if you want to know if you have some sort of Sami ancestry, you can always look through your family, through your family line, through your family names, because the last name is always telling, I would say. And try go through the church books in Sweden, for example, or the Swedish archives. And that is where I would advise you to start, because if you're lucky, that is where you will find it. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Absolutely. So I do want to, somebody asked if you can go over the difference between indigenous and native again, so that they kind of understand it a little bit better. And so I want to ask that first and foremost.
Yeah. So again, to sum it up, to simplify this, being indigenous and being native derives from specific things when it comes to the UN, right? The UN Code of Law. For example, to be indigenous, you would have had to live on the countryside, like the Sami, for example, prior to that continent became a country, prior to the official country borders were laid out. And that you, the people, the Sami people, for example, my people, would have had their own culture, their own language, their own practices, and all that. That is very separated and differentiated from the Swedish culture, the main culture, right? It would have a complete different culture. And there's someone who is native, that is the people who were basically of the majority here. So a Swede is native, for example, because they lived here even prior it became a country, but also they were the majority population of the country being founded. They were the majority population of the main lines of families that created the country, the kings, the queens, and all, and all that. So it is really a matter of ancestry and ethnicity in a form way of background of where you come from.
Absolutely. I want to address a couple of things in the comments. And I want to address one thing. So when we look at the settling of Scandinavia, we see two distinct groups coming up. This is from the archaeological standpoint. We see a group coming up who is dark of skin and light of eye, and we see a group coming over and up who is light of skin and dark of eye. The Finno-Ugric group coming over and up settles the northern half, and the dark-skinned, light-eyed Germanic peoples, or ancestors of the Germanic peoples. They have shared ancestry. They are not necessarily at this time the same. The Germanic tribes have not been named as Germanic at this time, right? So a group coming up, and we see that they tend to push north later on. The Sami are an Arctic people, like our Arctic people here in the United States and Canada and the Turtle Islands. In fact, there's a lot of, cross cultural thought process too sometimes, right, that I have seen. I'll mention that in a second. Let me finish that. But when we're looking at that, as the ice is receding, the group is pushing up into lands that are becoming livable for them, whereas the Sami could live on those lands as an Arctic people. I'm talking about the crossing of the Arctic that we actually see with the Siberian steppes bloodline, because X1 mitochondrial DNA is here in the Turtle Islands, and X2 mitochondrial DNA, the daughter DNA of X1, is in Siberia. The connection between Turtle Island indigenous people and Siberia is a backwards connection. And then it's always curious to me that both the Sami and the Plains people, who the Dene language group goes from the southern tip of Mexico up into the Great Plains, and then starts again in northern California and goes up almost into Alaska. And so the Dene language group, and that doesn't mean everybody speaks Dene, it's just a root language for everybody who doesn't know in the listening. They also have the Arctic connection, right? And I'm not saying Lakota groups is Dene, but that the teepee crosses somewhere, right? Because you see that both the Sami and many of the Plains indigenous people have, Turtle Island indigenous Plains people have teepees, and they're very, very, similar in structure and look. So to me, it means that there's some of that Arctic. And when you look at the Arctic, from an above look, it is literally just a bunch of, icy islands that Arctic people can absolutely jump across, and they're already living within that. So I think that's that backwards. But so when you see the Scandinavians pushing up, the Scandinavians start and found those countries that they found. And so they're native of those countries, or the founding of those countries. But the Sami have been living there already and are getting pushed up as the ice recedes. And they maintain their heritage and their ancestry. And this is why they become indigenous. Is my understanding of what you were saying, to kind of clarify a little bit. And I hope I didn't go silent. Am I silent? Okay, perfect. I don't mean to either. I also don't mean to splain you either. Just to make sure my understanding is correct as well, and to give a little bit of archaeological background. And then I saw something else in here that I needed to address really quick. So Turtle Island Indigenous people are not from Asia. Turtle Island Indigenous people start coming to the Americas. Our oldest find of actually Homo sapiens comes from 33,000 years ago. And there is 10,000 years after. So the ancestor of everybody outside of Africa, except for Indigenous Australians, leaves the Levant area at roughly 50,000 years ago. And this is what the DNA shows us, right? And as they're moving, we see that certain groups go across the exposed Asia. And that when the people who eventually come over to Turtle Island come out, they stay in that space for roughly 10,000 years and get Denisovian DNA before they do the Southern Cross.
You froze a bit there for a bit, so we missed a whole chunk of that.
Sorry. Let me start back where I was, I think. There's unique DNA in Turtle Island Indigenous people. And our first finds for Turtle Island Indigenous people who are sapiens is roughly 33,000 years ago. The last common ancestor of everybody outside of Africa leaves the Levant area roughly 50,000 years ago, except for Indigenous Australians who make it to Australia 70,000 years ago. We see within Indigenous Turtle Island blood DNA that there's 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovian DNA. And this tells us Denisovian, who is in the lower part of Eurasia, the lower eastern part of Eurasia, so Southeast Asia, and that DNA is all down in there. So it tells us that they spent about 10,000 years there before they come across the islands of the South Pacific, which is the current studies, and come into the Turtle Islands. So then they meet up with another species here in the Turtle Islands that is a ghost species that is a descendant of Homo erectus, like Neanderthal is a descendant of Homo erectus. We share a common ancestor with, and they envelop that species within their tribe, and we see a ghost species in their DNA. Ghost species are species that we see a little bit of in their DNA, but we don't see any of that whole species in the fossil record. So we just have a little chunk of them in sapien DNA. So Turtle Island Indigenous people do not have Asian ancestry. There is some backward migration, and there are some later groups that come over because there is a lot of, they are currently looking at least 3 waves of migration. So I wanted to address that.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing.
Absolutely.
Or not correct, but to form a thing. So it's the Sami people. The tent thingy, the housing looks like a teepee, but it is actually formed in a different and a bigger way than a teepee, and it is also called labu or kota, and it can basically be built. It doesn't have to be a tent. It can be built by timber, by some form of planking or sticks or anything like that as well. So that is a little thing that I want to just
Thank you.
add on.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, no worries.
And please let me clarify. I never meant to imply they were the same thing.
No.
Just that the similarity is.
Yeah, I know that. I just want to give you the name of it.
And I totally appreciate. Okay, so again,
Sarafina, I know her.
Okay, absolutely.
Hello, how are you today?
Hello. I'm good.
So firstly, Northern Scald spoke so eloquently, and I thank you so much for giving a voice to this. Like you awesome. You're so awesome. I just wanted to add a small portion to this discussion, as there had been several comments in the chat about DNA kits like 23andMe and looking to those for ancestry and things like that. So if you are looking to see if you have any kind of Sami heritage, it's actually better to go the genealogist route, to hire a genealogist to find out where your family came from, originated, etc. Because a lot of those testing kits, especially readily available testing kits, and I will say the DNA that you were speaking on earlier, this is all clinical DNA testing, not readily available 23andMe, because all of those kinds of DNA kits are based comparatively. So you can have a general idea of region, but to have anything more specific than that requires a more specific DNA test that are not readily available to the public unless they are specifically sought out at a much higher cost.
Agreed with that. They're like $300 at the start. It's a whole genomic.
They are, yeah, they're very expensive, and so it can be often misleading when taking those ancestry tests or 23andMe tests, because it only works on a very small comparative basis. And there are many of studies out there that have gone into kind of the faulty nature of that kind of DNA testing. One I really enjoyed was actually through CBC Marketplace, which is a Canadian program, and they did a test on several groups of twins that sent in at the same time, and they all got different results. So that kind of gave a rough idea of, you know, the kind of range of maybe there is with those kinds of tests. But I did see several comments going through the chat talking about how, oh, if I took a 23andMe, would I be able to find out? And I would say, honestly, broadly, probably not. You probably wouldn't be able to find out specifics about your ancestry through a test like that.
Correct.
I would agree with that 100%. There is on my site in widdaord.com, there is a tab that will link you to sites that will take any DNA tests that you do have and match them to different spaces. But again, what she said applies, or they said applies. I'm not sure gender. I don't want to misgender. And what they said still applies, that it is a broad. And so it's not going to give you, even when you're taking it over, it might give you closeness, but it won't give you an exact. There is on that tab also the cheapest whole genomic space that I have found. So you can go there and look for that. I wanted to state, because it is important, that for Indigenous groups everywhere across the globe, having DNA connection to that Indigenous group does not make you a part of that Indigenous group. That even if I see that I have Sami ancestors, which, I mean, sure, there's Sami's ancestors on my, that does not mean that unless I go to Sami people and find my lineage and connect to that group and work for that group, I am not Sami. I am not Indigenous to the Sami. I have ancestors who are, and that works globally.
Yeah, the difference between ancestry and heritage. I just did a video on my page with that. You can have ancestry and that does not equate a heritage, just like you can have heritage to something and not have an ancestry. Heritage is the lived experience of. And so if you have no one in your family that has any lived experience of within, 5, 10 generations, then you no longer have that heritage. And that's not a bad thing.
No, exactly. And that was basically the thing with my kind of situation, because like I know a lot of, like, my friend, she has also some ancestry, right? But like, again, like you said, she doesn't claim that. She has some ancestry, but she doesn't claim being some, because she hasn't gone through this whole reconnecting part. She doesn't go through, or she hasn't gone through any of that kind of, or she's not trying to claim anything, but she's still she has still acknowledged that she has that ancestry, that is part of her, but she's not claiming to the indigenuity.
Yes, well, even in my case, my mother is Sami, and she emigrated to Canada when she was quite young, and so I, while I understand and love and accept that I have that kind of ancestry, and I give my support to that as much as possible, it's not specifically my lived experience. I grew up in Canada to the daughter of two immigrants, like that's my lived experience. So while I have some connection to it, and sure, I have some lived experience through them and through their culture, it's not my lived experience.
Exactly. And to clarify a thing here, what we are talking about here is that when we are claiming things through blood quantum, for example, that is not really valid, because there's a lot of problematic situation within that, and there's a lot of toxicity and negativity with that history of blood quantum and biological research and all of that. So that is why there's a difference of accepting the ancestry and claiming your ancestry. Like, there's a difference in it. And so if any confusion hits, it's basically because the view of blood quantum is in here, at least, is built on white supremacy. And that is why, for example, when we are trying to say that, but to be Sami, for example, or to be recognized as Sami in Sametinget, in the Sameting, you needed to have at least, or to be able to sit in the Sameting, I should say, you need to be able to either have your parents or grandparents or have someone who speaks Sami in your home.
Yeah.
To be able to sit in the Sameting.
That makes sense.
And then when it comes to reindeer herding, for example, as well, that also require a form of process to get your own herding mark, basically.
Can I ask? Is that set by Sami people, or is that set by, say, the Swedish government to recognize Sami people?
That is set by the Sameting.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
But
I think you can apply it to the government in order to get a dispensation for land or something like that.
Yeah,
I don't know the specifics, but I do know there is a way of applying that to the broader political thing.
Well, my only question was because the difference would tell me whether or not it was something that the government created to control and erase, or whether or not it was something that Sami created themselves to ensure sovereignty and
yeah, it's more that.
Okay,
absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure. That's what I was asking. Yeah.
Herding.
1 second, really quick before you get started again. Augusta, today we're kind of talking a little bit more about the experience not in the Turtle Islands. We're talking about experience in other areas across the globe, groups that are currently fighting for recognition, groups that do have recognition, but peoples on the other side in Eurasia and in Africa. Somebody did mention that there were no indigenous groups in Africa. There are UN recognized indigenous groups in Africa and UN recognized indigenous groups in Asia. But we're talking about the other side of the globe, and that's why I was holding on, just because I'm trying to keep it to people of indigenous, either within that fight for recognition or currently recognized in other spaces. I will be holding more, and we've done it before, but I will be holding more for people on this side. I just, I'm trying to keep it a little bit more over there today, just because we're having a lot of debate, not debate, but there's a lot of issue currently going on. There's a lot of erasure going on with a lack of recognition by Americans of what it means to be indigenous in other spaces. Yes, there are indigenous groups in Africa. They're named by the UN. The UN actually has named indigenous groups in Africa. But many people in the United States and Canada especially fail to recognize what it means to be indigenous in other areas, what it means to be native in other areas, what the differences are, what the fights are, the fights that are still going on, and that these things exist. And oftentimes it is used as white supremacy within the United States and Canada. Well, I'm in a Nordic indigenous person, which does not exist. The Sami are the indigenous people of Scandinavia. And, you know, using that as a white supremacist talking point and tactic. And so we're trying to combat some of that today specifically. Did you still want to come up? Let me know in the comments and I'll have you come up. I just wanted to say.
And just before I can hop off anytime. Just before I go though, I would highly recommend everybody go and check out and sign, please sign the petition towards the government and the use of traditional Sami land. It has been over 600 days of them using that land unlawfully. So please go check it out. Go sign the petition.
Do you have a copy of that petition?
Or something.
I believe it's linked in my bio. And if not, I will hop off now and go link it immediately in my bio.
Okay, I've got you followed. Thank you for coming up and thank you for
All right.
speaking.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Why did I say no problem?
You're good. You're good.
You do like I do also. I was like, wait, no.
That's why I say you tell me thank you, and I'm like, thank you. Or, you know, have a nice day. Happy birthday. Happy birthday, you know.
Yeah. No. Like I was going to say there, there are some areas, however, in Sweden when it comes to the summiting. Gonna jump on back there.
Yes, please.
That sadly has it still under the Swedish government's control, because the summiting isn't freely an own government yet, but they have still a lot of control they can do. But then there's also things that they have to go through the Swedish government to get approved of. But when it comes to who are able to sit in the summiting and who is able to vote and things like that, that is only within the summiting who can decide that. The Swedish government has no saying in that.
That's awesome.
What is the Sami meeting? What is the Sami meeting?
So the summiting is basically the Sami people's government, you can say. And both you have a summiting in Norway, here in Sweden, and in Finland, and I believe the Russian Sami also have some form of thing. I'm not certain. But yeah, so each country has their own individual, or each area of the Sami has their own thing, basically.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. So yeah.
I wanted to state again, because I just said something. Again, this space today is being held for non-American Indigenous fight. It happens here, and we often hold space for that, though your profile is why I did not accept you. I will say that first and foremost, because your profile tells me that you're already erasing Indigenous people, and I'm not going to give you platform to do that more. But when we're talking, this space today is being held for specific groups. It is not that you won't have space being held, though maybe not you specifically because of that, in future things, but we absolutely hold space for Afro-Indigenous people, and we absolutely hold space for Turtle Island Indigenous people in my space. Frequently, I am Turtle Island Indigenous. That's not the point of today's conversation, just to be said. These people are both minorities in their own country, to your comment. I am absolutely holding space for minority, just not American space today. It's just not American space today. So, no, we're okay, Augusta. I just wanted to state that. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt anybody. Again, you're not welcome up. You can stop requesting.
It is hard. I just want to say that it's hard to follow the comments as well when it keeps bombardiering. So if we're missing a lot of questions or anything like that, we are sorry. But the chat is frequently floating. So if we're missing anything, it's because of that. So
well, and I'm actually focusing on the comments, so I can point out anything missed.
Back up. So in case if there was something we missed.
No, you're fine. They were accusing me of taking too many of the comments and reading the comments. We've talked. I know a lot of the conversation that we're having, so I can listen and still pay attention to comments, which is what I'm doing to catch any questions so that I can point them out to people. So they are being paid attention to. Don't you worry about that. You continue on with what you're trying to give and being so beautiful in doing so. But well, and I will interact with the chat because that's teaching. That's what this is here for. Like we've already discussed, the fact of Indigenous versus Native because of questions for clarification with the chat and things like that. We are addressing things, and that's part of the teaching concept. Go right ahead. I apologize. My MD.
No worries. Yeah. Anything else that you were wondering, or anyone else were wondering, by the way? Because, yeah.
Awesome. If there are any questions, so Sleepy is here talking about the Khumri people and the fight that the Khumri have. And Scald is here talking about the Sami people and some of the things that they're going through. The Khumri are still fighting to be, Khumri are still fighting to be recognized. The Sami are recognized by the UN, but still going through this struggle for decolonization and sovereignty. So they're both here to, kind of give us some of their love and their information and share with us what is going on in other parts of the globe in these fights. And you have questions, you can absolutely ask the questions. Again, I don't open up my boxes to people I don't know or haven't been like approved by others. I did want to address a couple of the things that I did see while I'm waiting to see if there are questions. I did see something about 4C hair, which is more accurately. Did you?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Scald. Absolutely. I've marked it down. I can wait.
No, sorry. I just recognized a creator who was like tagging. I was like, who are you? I'm like, oh.
Nice. 4C, or tightly coiled, which is the better way to state it because the word 4C comes from the rating scale of the eugenics program. But tightly coiled hair is seen around the globe. It is seen in every space, well, almost every space. It's not something that's always directly related to ancestry. You can find people with tightly coiled hair in Scandinavia. I grew up with two people from Scandinavia who had tightly coiled hair. And I remember there was a river dance that was in the early 90s where the singer was an Irish woman with tightly coiled red hair. So you can absolutely see tightly coiled hair everywhere. So it's probably in several spaces in Asia, but that's not what makes Asian Indigenous people. Asian Indigenous people have other qualifiers. And then somebody was talking about blood type. Blood type is not unique to any specific group. Blood type kind of goes everywhere. Same thing with RH factor, which is a totally different thing. There's some videos in my profile on that one. But none of those things are distinct for different groups. When we're looking at DNA, there's distinction, but not within blood type. I just wanted to address those things.
And that is also why I said earlier that when we were looking at ancestry and heritage, that blood quantum and blood type is not what we are looking at. So I agree 100% with that.
Absolutely. Again, to address some of the comments, today's space is being held for understanding what Indigenous people in other areas outside the United States and Canada go through. We frequently hold Indigenous space for United States and Canada in here. I am Turtle Island Indigenous, but today's space is about understanding what other people's struggle is. It is a lesson of understanding other people's struggle, which is something that I was taught as an Indigenous person was important. And because of the fact that land back anywhere is land back everywhere. And that's really the only way that we can move forward. If you have things that you want to ask Godly, you're more than welcome to ask them in the chat. You don't need to get up and physically speak. Again, I'm not saying it anymore. That's it. That's done. And if you are from one of those groups that is not here in the Turtle Islands, that is trying to fight for recognition, or if you are, trying to, or is actually currently recognized, of which there are 90 countries across the globe that have recognized Indigenous people by the UN. There's something like 500 or 5,000 Indigenous nations recognized by the UN. And if you are a part of one of those groups and you would like to come up, you're free to. If you are a part of a group here in the United States and Canada, we often hold that space. Today is not the day. Much love, and you can come back on one of the other days if you would like to speak. Any questions for the two people who are so beautifully giving their time and energy and labor, who are absolutely minorities in their own country and who absolutely face all the levels of discrimination that anybody who is considered a minority in this space tends to face? And I mean, I know personally, I know like the Sami had residential schools in the 30s, and are currently on what we might equivocate as reservations. Like they've been pushed into space that they're only allotted specific spaces. I do not believe that it had the same level of, had to be carded and stuff like that you see here. But, I do know that there is removal of space and stuff like that. Godly melanated people aren't the only people who are marginalized across the world, and you need to get that through your head. Do not start anymore or you will be muted in this chat. You've been given a lot of leeway. Sorry.
No worries. Like you said, yes. So here's the thing when it came to the nomad schools, as it were called, or the summer schools. It was basically to Christianize them, to make them good Christians. And what happened there is also that we can see that even though the parents of these students, they had better control because the government were not able to do the same thing that the American government did to us, the American Indigenous. So the Sami had a little better control anyway, but it was still a lot of discrimination, racism, hate, going on and pushed on. And we were really, really close to actually go through a mass slaughter, but it ended, or it stopped basically just before it was going to happen. They changed their mind, basically. That it did.
I have a question. Is the Norwegian theft of Sami land somehow like deeply intertwined with like their actions in South American and Chile taking Mapuche land? Like how? I understand that their root connection is that Norway is a colonial nation state, but I'm not understanding. Like, is it an organized like thing against Indigenous people globally, or is it like being opportunistic?
Yeah, no, it's the company, it's the Norwegian company basically right now that has pushed the same thing agenda towards the Sapmi land. We're pushing up windmills and all that. It's now also pushing away that people, like it's also like reaching out and doing another thing in another country towards another Indigenous people as well. So it's the same company who are just trying to be basically just what I think the term is green colonize, something with green colonization. So basically that is what's going on, if I understood correctly on the section. So yeah.
By the way, Augusta is melanized.
But other than that, I wouldn't say that there's really a connection to that. It's just that it's always been a colonial land, even though it has not. Even though Sweden and Norway has been pretty good at hiding that dark history, it's still there. It still exists.
I'm going to try and move so that maybe if I can get closer to the internet, this will be better. So it might like weird out for just a second as I'm doing that, just so you all know. Because I see that it keeps like freezing up on everybody. I have all of this weird stuff I've got to move around. I think, and I know we have people in here who weren't here earlier. So God, make sure that I'm not like giving you a shot of my underarm. Let me do this smarter if I can. I think that people might not have been in here earlier who were able to hear some of the conversation about what is going on with the fight to be recognized in some other countries. We've heard a little bit about, hold on, sorry, the, fights that are currently going on. But it might be important to understand that when we're looking at, fuck, Sarah, I'm doing so great at this. Different groups of people, that there is such a fight to be recognized by some groups. There has been a conversation lately about the fact that, like there's people here in the United States who want to call the Nordic people Indigenous instead of recognizing the Sami as Indigenous.
Your camera is backwards, I think.
Yes.
You're aware.
Just so that you guys weren't seeing my underarms.
Okay.
I'm like, the last thing I want is for you guys to see my underarms as I'm coming out. So you can see my house, but not my underarms. Just because it felt rude. That's not what I wanted.
To be honest, I'd rather you see my underarms in my house.
I'm so freshly moved in that my house is still pretty decent. But when we're looking at that fight for recognition, and we're looking at that understanding that, like, the Swedes aren't trying to be recognized as an Indigenous group. People, to my knowledge at least, right? I might be wrong, but the Swedes that I know are not. I know people that will say, like what Fable had said, we're looking at Native people, not Indigenous people. So when we're talking about that fight for recognition and acceptance, I want to make sure that that's understood. That we're not looking at, if you're over here in the Turtle Islands and you're trying to be recognized trying to claim, well, I've got Nordic heritage and therefore it's closed practice, it's Indigenous, is one of the things that was come across lately. It's important to recognize that Scandinavian people, to my knowledge, are not fighting to be recognized as Indigenous like the Kumri people are, or like the Irish people are, or like, well, maybe not the Irish, but the Kennewick.
Kennewick Canal. Canal is the name for Cornwall. Kennewick is, I think, the name for the language. I'm not sure about the name for the people.
Somebody asked who would be considered two Slavic areas, and to understand that, you have to understand that the areas occupied by Slavs have a very long history, and it's not like there are so many different Slavic groups, including ones that aren't extinct, and then there are cousin groups like the Baltics, that you can't really that's not really that's not really a question that has one answer. Russia, for example, has I think over 80 different groups that might be considered Indigenous just in Central Asia, Northern Asia alone.
Yeah.
I would take Seraphima's advice and go look into the list of Indigenous people around the globe. But you also have to understand that because of Russia being a colonial power, many groups that were indigenous to land they now occupy no longer exist. So there may no longer be a group that is indigenous to that area, unfortunately.
And yes, exactly. Thank you, Maya.
Well, and I think that especially coming from a diaspora, trying to claim, as was being said earlier, collection without that lived experience, right? Now here, a lot of we talk a lot about reconnecting. And there's a lot of people that are working on reconnection. There's a lot of people who are connected. There's a lot of judgment from either side, but when we're looking at that, we have to understand that that reconnection is a connection to the understanding, like a connection to the cultural space, a connection to understanding how people live and move within that cultural space, and that we can absolutely reconnect. But that involves going into a space, that involves finding the lineage, that going and seeing what your lineage is and tracing your lineage to specific spaces. And it involves being a part of those specific spaces to live that experience, right? So if you are here in the United States, I have friends who are here in the United States who are immigrants, who are Sami. I went to Standing Rock with one. So they have lived Sami experience. They are, I think they're a first generation child, an immigrant, but they have lived in Sami territory several times. They know their language, they know their peoples, all that sort of stuff. So they have lived experience of being Sami. For me to claim Sami heritage, I would have to go and reconnect and live with the Sami people and understand Sami culture, and not the Sami culture here within the United States, but the Sami people living within a space of Indigenous connection, right? Same thing if I was trying to be recognized as being Kumri, I would need to go and live within that space and understand and be a part of that lived experience. So when you are in the diaspora and you're sitting here going, well, this is who I am and I'm Indigenous to this space, I'm a part of this lived experience, but you've never lived that experience, and you're trying to claim what is other people's rights within that indigeneity, even if you're talking about Indigenous groups, which in the case of the person who was talking before, it wasn't about Indigenous groups, but even if you're talking about Indigenous groups, you still need to have that connection to be that, right? To be like, this is who I am.
Yeah, I mean, when you specifically want to talk about Khmer culture as a collective is perhaps slightly different to my understanding of the majority Indigenous cultures around the world. So, for instance, my loose understanding, as explained to me by Turtle Island Indigenous people, to be considered Indigenous, you have to have at least a single drop of Indigenous blood plus have that connection. But for the Khmer people, it's a little bit less or more complicated than that, I guess, because it's more about the connection than it is about the blood. The Khmer have always been an open and welcoming people, and in fact, you can have somebody who lives in a diaspora like the US that has ancestry connected to the Khmer, but they would never be considered as Khmer as the people who live in Khmer who have zero ancestry. You can, when you talk about the Welsh identity or the Khmer identity, you can divide that into two aspects. You can divide that into nationality and you can divide that into identity. And to be Khmer through nationality, you either need to be born here, even if you were only here for like a few weeks or whatever, you can claim Khmer as a nationality. You can be have like recent heritage or recent ancestry, i.e. your parents or grandparents were born here, or you can live here and have zero connection to any of the other things. You only need to meet one of those requirements to be considered Welsh as a national identity if you choose that. But when it comes to the specific identity, it's very, very similar rules. You can be born here, you can have ancestry of any kind, or you can live here. But the most important thing and the condition with any of those things is you need the connection. You can't you can't just live here and not be connected to any of the culture and claim you're Welsh realistically as an identity. You can still say that you're a nationality, but there's no requirement of having any Indigenous blood or any blood that is native to the area. It's a much more of an open kind of culture in that sense. but yeah, my next door neighbor who might be from, I don't know, Africa, who, you know, or a place in Africa like Nigeria, they would be considered more Welsh than somebody who happens to have some kind of heritage with Cymru who happens to live in Wales.
Absolutely. So I think that here in the Turtle Islands, to be a member of a tribe, you need to be recognized, or a nation, you need to be recognized. A lot of people forget to, and I mean, a lot of people here forget to understand that Mexicans, or those of South American descent, or those who are South American, are absolutely indigenous as well, that don't have connections to those nations within the United States and Canada, right? So there are a lot of people who are absolutely indigenous who don't have a connection to the federally recognized nations, right? And I think that that's something that, so I think that to claim membership of a nation, you absolutely have to have that connection within that nation, which would be that equivalent, right? And I know for a fact that to claim, say I was to claim membership of the Oglala Lakota, if I was to claim membership of the Oglala Lakota, I could be somebody with absolutely no Turtle Island indigenous ancestry, but who was adopted into the tribe or who grew up within, then I can claim that membership. So that's very similar actually with the Cymru. And it's more about connection when you're looking at specific nations. When you're looking at people who some of their nations didn't actually pass down after colonization, then you're looking at people who may not necessarily need that this nation claims me to still be indigenous, right? Because you're part of the community you're working within, or because you're recognizing yourself as indigenous and recognizing yourself as a part of that fight. And I just want to make sure that because so many people like, well, if you're from south of the American border, then you're not indigenous, you know, you're this, and it's like, no, that's not true. And that I really feel like it is as much about recognition of a nation here as anything else, like as much about belonging to, because like here, yes, if you have one drop of indigenous blood, you are indigenous. You still need to like so many people will have that indigenous blood. I saw it the other day with somebody as a Welsh perspective, or and they said Welsh, and that's as a Cymru perspective. Somebody was like, "Well, my grandmother is Cymru, so I get to decide that the Cymru aren't indigenous." And it's like, well, but that's like saying my great great grandmother is a Cherokee princess, and so I get to speak over indigenous people, right? Like it's you can have that blood within you, but if you are not like actively participating in that connection, whether or not it's to an actual nation or it's to the land and the space, right? If you're not actually having that one drop doesn't really, it's often used in a negative, right? It's often used for that white supremacist talking point shit. Though still blood quantum is not something we should be following, right? So and I think because we can see that people forget that those struggles are really global, right? That it's not just struggles that we're going through here, or those correlations aren't really just what's going through here. It's in other spaces too.
I will also say that the amount of people who don't want to connect to their ancestry but want to utilize it is astronomical and extremely concerning. Because I have seen so many people who would definitely qualify as being Indigenous if they wanted to be, utilize their position to speak over actually connected people to like support their friends or some sort of agenda. And like I think a lot of people forget that there are so many agenda driven people like opposing the greater Indigenous community that they will utilize, that they are perfectly fine with like essentially tokenizing themselves to like gain some sort of social or monetary advantage. And that's so frustrating.
It's incredibly frustrating as well for some, you know, from me and my perspective, from my culture, to see people trying to use my culture to justify appropriating other people's cultures and trying to claim some kind of connection to, say, my culture, and therefore that's a reason that they can paint certain symbols on their face or whatever. And it's like, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to pretend that you're connected to my culture and tokenize that so that you can then weaponize that against other marginalized groups. Not at all.
Why? What? St. Michael is not Lucifer. I am rooting you. What is wrong? I mean, it does say they're crazy.
I do want to address one of Michael's comments really quick. He had said that if you go back far enough, everybody is dark of skin. All Indigenous people are dark of skin. And I want to point out that when we were talking earlier, we were talking about the settling of Scandinavia. I think it's really weird right now. The settling of Scandinavia being by two different groups. And one is a Finno-Uric, light-skinned, dark-eyed group, and one is a dark-skinned, light-eyed group. So in this case, the actual colonizers were the dark-skinned group, whereas the Indigenous people were the light-skinned group. So no, not all people are dark-skinned when their indigeneity to a space starts.
Oh, a really good example of this is the Amazigh people. They're so diverse. There are many, many different Amazigh tribes, and some are very light-skinned, and then others are extremely, extremely dark-skinned, and they all recognize each other as Amazigh, and like skin tone is not really important to them. I also will say though, Sleepy Bear, you're absolutely right that a lot of people will claim like Khmer ancestry and use it to speak over other Indigenous people. Like once I saw somebody claim that white sage was sacred to Khmer people and that they should use it in, I think, seining, and I absolutely lost my mind. I was like, I cannot engage with.
So seining. Yeah, seining itself is not actually Indigenous or culturally appropriate to my people. Seining is, I think, more specific to perhaps Scotland or the
Scottish.
Irish.
Yeah, I was like, what are you talking about?
And this is another thing that really kind of like gets my grump on when it comes to this idea of like the Celtic peoples.
No, they think there's.
Yeah, they think we're homogenous. First and foremost, to be called British is a real problem for me anyway, because it is so anglicised. If you ask an American person or a US citizen to do an English accent, a British accent, they're always going to do a proper English accent. They're not going to do a Scottish or a Welsh accent or an Irish accent, even though they are technically all British accents. But also, Celtic, when you're not living within the Celtic regions, seems to be synonymous, particularly with the Irish culture or the Irish practices. You Google Celtic and you will come up with the top 10 results to do with Irish practices. And the thing is, we are so diverse. Even if you look at specifically the Cymry people, or what was the Cymric people, which were the people that inhabited the entirety of the southern part of Britain, we used to live in tribes. We used to live in separate peoples. We would have had our own cultures and identities specific to those things. A lot of crossover, absolutely, that we are our own unique culture. Yes, we have some similarities. Yes, our practices would have been to observe the, changes of the seasons and stuff like that. But then you see modern practices like Wicca that try to again homogenize in its entirety, like the Wheel of the Year. It uses words inappropriately, and it claims like Beltane as the kind of like the universal celebration of that particular time of year.
Half of the Wheel of the Year is ripped from Judaism, and then they just replace the stuff in there. Like no Celtic language speaking group has ever had sabbats unless you are a Jewish person who happens to live in, like, I don't know, the former territories of the Gaulish people. Like, let's use our brain here. But I will say one of the most infuriating things for me has always been the term, like, Celtic pagan or Celtic witchcraft. Like,
Celtic paganism is an umbrella term, yeah.
Like, at one point, that was a fourth of Europe. Maybe, like, half of Europe. It went all the way down to Turkey. Which Celts? Who are you talking? Be more specific.
Exactly. There
Like,
are very
Celtic is
few
a language
things.
group.
Yeah, there are very few things that unify all of us. And in fact, I think there's only one thing off the top of my head that I can think was pretty much homogenous to the entirety of the Celtic groups, and that is tartan. Tartan was very common and traded amongst Celtic peoples throughout the entire of the Indo-European people. It's obviously become more synonymous with Scottish identity these days because of kilts and stuff, but kilts are actually used within Cymru and Canal in Cornwall, and even places in Ireland, and I think in Brittany in the northern regions of France, which is another Celtic region. So yeah, there are very few things that actually unify every single Celtic identity in its entirety. You know, there are similarities and there are crossovers, but we are all our own beautiful, separate identities, and we celebrate each other.
And the other thing I hate is that people will mix and match different aspects of different Celtic cultures. Like, I really need people to not sing in honor of like the Irish gods, because what is and so I have so many opinions. I'm like, what are you guys doing?
I mean,
I was like, this is why nobody likes Americans, guys. Like,
yeah,
It is.
the Celtic practices
it's not like us.
the Celtic practices themselves, in terms of what is thought of as Celtic paganism, is not necessarily a closed practice. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily connected to a specific Celtic identity. There are aspects of cultures within the Celtic umbrella that do have closed practices, like seining is a Scottish thing, but cleansing as a ritual is pretty much unifying, but we use native or indigenous plants to do so. Certainly don't use white sage, but yeah, I mean, you can pretty much cleanse with anything that is pure. So
Yeah, and I want to touch on something that Maya said earlier in the comments. Birgit Maya is Sami, Norwegian Sami, and I want to touch on about something that she brought up, Mara talked about, and the racism or hate that we see here from people who claim being Sami, or I'm experiencing most of, it's not Americans who are trying to claim. That is more recent that I've noticed that Americans now finding out that, oh, there are indigenous groups over there and who are, pale or who are lighter tone, that's or fair skinned. So it's like, so now they're gonna grab that. But what I've been experiencing most of, and like Maya have said, what we have experienced most are that it coming from our own countries, our country people. The racism, the hate, people who are just trying to claim it and then just spread hate. Because it was not that long ago that I was passed through a hate storm by some trolls that claimed being Sami and that I was wrong, and then I didn't speak for that and blah 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 blah. It was a whole charade. Anyway, so thing is, for us, it comes from within, right? And the government basically does nothing at all because there's not enough evidence or there's not enough things to do. And that is why there's so many Sami people who are quiet when it happens. And that is why also there's so much silence, for example, when okay, sure, yes. There have been moments where police have investigated when a reindeer has been killed or when a reindeer has been driven over or slaughtered as a hate crime. But most of those times, it's just investigations and then they're being put down. Or because there's so much racism and hatred within the countries that is not being talked about because they're just like, oh no, but they're just being darkened. And that is a lot of what we are facing a lot of. So yeah, and that is quite
a heavy thing to face because it comes from within, right? So even wearing this shirt that I'm wearing and having my necklace, like out in public, kind of scares me a bit because it's like, okay, who will give me the side eye? Who will like comment? Or who will maybe walk up to me and yada yada yada. So there's a lot of things that I need to be aware of when going outside, either having my jewelry or some sort of that shows that I'm Sami. I mean, there wasn't even that long ago there when a Sami woman or Sami girl were beaten basically because she all she had was a Sami kofta, like a top, like one of the clothing, Sami clothing, and she was beaten for that. I think it was in Oslo, Norway, last year or something like that. It happened. So these kind of hate crimes happens to us, even though yes, we might look like this, we might look like however, whatever, but these kind of hate crimes and racism and it still happens to us. And just because we look like this doesn't mean we are granted something extra, something special, like many Americans believe or might think. But we still are facing a lot of things, and that is why I'm getting so sick and tired of when people, like for example, recently when they're like erasing the Sami ancestry and to claim that Norse paganism is an closed indigenous practice. It's like that one really like dug deep onto me. It's like, no, I'm not gonna just sit idle by after fighting for so long to both get my identity back and also to like just yeah. It's enough. It's annoying and it's just energy taking.
I agree, absolutely. It
Yeah.
takes so much energy
Yeah,
out.
definitely. My children are affected by the hate a lot.
It's kind of like
people.
oh sorry, I say it's kind of like really really hard to hear those kinds of things. I mean, the company don't have any comparable instance of that, and when you look deeper into that, there is like quite a sad reason why. So the most we will face is discrimination and prejudice because we are Welsh. If we speak with a Welsh accent, we're going to get people showing a lot of xenophobia. If we march for independence, we get a lot of pushback from, unionists and things like that. We do face hate, but not on the same level. Absolutely not. And the reasons behind that is because we are so far down the line from our original peoples. We are so far colonized that there are a lot of people, even within my own culture and society, that pretty much just roll over and accept it and pretty much glorify the ways of essentially the colonist. And we wouldn't be anything without England. Well, that's a lie sold to you by the British government that wants to take your resources. So I think, we can't compare our lived personal experiences in that sense. And I don't think anybody should be trying to quantify the trauma that any group faces, because once you start to try and quantify, it's only a skip and a jump before you get people trying to justify. We can definitely draw parallels and bridges of similarities. And I think that these bridges of similarities are so important because they do encourage connection and compassion and empathy. And when you have those aspects, you connect as humans, you can then join together to fight for what is needed on all sides. But it's also very wrong to try and say that they're the same. And that's very important, particularly for people of my culture, to understand when we're not facing as much direct threat. And to allow people space to have their moment and say, this is what is happening, we need your help. And for people like me who understand the loss of culture, we have a word in our language called hiraif, which there is no direct translation, but the closest you're going to get is to it is something along the lines of a deep sense of homesickness for a country or a country that should have been. And we feel the loss of our culture and the epping loss of our culture that is still happening deep in our bones. There is no reason on earth why we wouldn't fight for somebody else's culture when we see it happening to them too. So, thank you for sharing is what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way.
No worries, no worries. I also, yeah, no worries. Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Does the Isle of Man have an Indigenous group?
So the Isle of Man falls into the Gaelic side of the Celtic individuals. So you can divide the Celtic individuals into what they call Q Celtic and P Celtic, which is basically the Gaelic and the Brythonic Celtic. So the Cymry, the Canal, and those that reside in Brittany, I can't remember the native name, we all fall into the Brythonic side. And that would have been joined with the Pictish people that lived in the northeastern regions of what is now Scotland. And then you have the Gaelic regions, which would have been Ireland and what is now Scotland. Scotland itself is a really, really weird kind of like mixture of culture because it technically is a joining of both Brythonic and Celtic identity, and it has language that represents. You need a drink? Okay, here you go, buddy. It represents both Gaelic and Brythonic cultures. But also has languages that represent Gaelic and Germanic languages that are legally recognised as languages within the area that is now Scotland. But their genetic makeup is so diverse and different to the rest of the Celtic identities because of that admixture. The Manx, the Isle of Man, they fall into the Gaelic. There is still some in there, Betty. There you go. The Manx, they fall into the Gaelic aspect. They still do have their own language. They still do have their own culture. Now, they are the closest, I think, in all the Celtic or mainstream Celtic identities that are closest to extinction in terms of their language. Now, I'm not saying that they are going to go extinct. I know that they are fighting for their language and they're fighting for their culture. It just depends on how much their identity as a group holds on to that. But they're also trying to bring back some other languages that were once Celtic identities, like the north region of what is now England. We're looking at Cumbric. Cumbric or Old Cumbric used to be a language spoken in that area, which is very similar to Welsh. And
Would that have been where Cumbria is?
Basically, yes. Yes, so basically that kind of region, not the definitive borders of the modern day, because essentially the Cymric people would have expanded. You don't. I'm sorry, I don't have anything else. So you don't like water?
I have a lawnmower going, so I've muted myself so you all know.
I don't have anything else, buddy. So, do you want to go and fill it up yourself in the sink? No. No. Okay.
I have another question. Are the Pavi considered Celtic, or are they something else?
The who?
Pavi, the Irish travelers?
That's a good question.
I think that might be a question that would best be answered by a Pavi person.
Possibly, yes. I don't want to invalidate somebody's identity to say that they're not, because that would be really, really wrong of me when I have zero understanding of it. I know that there is a lot of traveling groups that were part of, say, the Romani people that ended up within, say, the spaces that is now Ireland, and there are a lot of xenophobic slurs used against those kinds of people, which is really, really wrong. I tend to avoid trying to refer to anybody by anything other than traveler or nomadic person, because unless they correct me and tell me that they prefer something else.
Yeah, I was specifically told by one of my mutuals that they identify as Pavi and want to be called that. But I think it does depend on like the specific family, because the thing is that they are not even slightly monolithic, like not at all. Like the furthest thing from.
Are we talking about, and this may not be their preferred terminology, but this is terminology on the UN. Are we talking about the Irish traveling people?
Yeah.
So the UN defines
so.
them. The UN does define them as Indigenous. They are one of the list of Indigenous
That's
people.
what I figured. Yeah.
Yeah, travelers are generally considered a minority in whatever space that they occupy, because they don't necessarily stay in the place that they are indigenous to, but some of them will occupy those spaces. I personally have had to come to terms with a lot of decolonizing my own mindset, because when I grew up, and a lot of the people that grew up within England and Wales and spaces within the UK would have been inherently taught that travelers were wrongdoers and thieves and all these kind of misconcepts.
I was taught that too here. It took a lot of decolonization, and it was very painful.
Yeah, it's difficult when you come stumbling across these internal biases, which as a pasty-faced individual, even the most open-minded, we have them. You know, it's just so ingrained into our societies.
Guys, by the way, calling humans invasive is an aspect of eco. I'm just gonna. You can go. I don't care what ethnicity you are. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was just gonna drop in here quick. Sadly, I have to drop out because I'm gonna have to go to a meeting tomorrow. So I need to go out now and get to sleep, even though I'm probably not gonna be able to fall asleep until like 1 a.m.
Yeah.
Neurodivergence for the win.
If I know myself correctly.
Yeah, we all know this one.
It's been the last couple weeks for me.
It's like
About 4 a.m. for me.
That was me when I forgot to take my antidepressants for an entire week, and I was like, "Why am I so sad?" It would be. It's because of the antidepressants. I was like, "It's like my antidepressants aren't working," and then I checked, and I was like, "Oh."
Scald, thank you so much. So very much. Thank you, Scald, for coming up and for sharing and for it is labor. And I thank you for the labor that you're doing. And I know that you do it out of love. And I thank you for the labor that you're doing in love and trying to give understanding. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you guys yourself for having me, and thank you for doing all the work that you do, guys.
Thank you. I've shoved you a follow as well.
Yeah, I saw that. I followed you back.
I saw that.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Sleep
Bye.
sweet when it comes.
So a lot of people may not know this, but I'm a member of, I mean, obviously you can tell from the username, I'm sure Sleepy Bear knows who they are. Maybe I'm a member of the Mosley family, and they have a pretty gnarly history. Sir Oswald Mosley founded like a certain British political party, and there are so many people that come into these spaces and they say things and they expect me not to notice them because of how like discreet their Oswald Mosley's followers have become. But like if you look into a lot of the rhetoric about like invasive species and a bunch of other stuff, it goes all the way back to him and his peers.
So are we talking about the Whig Party? Or are we talking about
Sir Oswald Mosley was almost made the British Empire one of the Axis powers. He came within 100 votes of beating a different candidate for prime minister. I'm imagining he went to jail for a very long time. I don't know. All I know is he did go to jail, and his family still had all the land or something, I guess.
Well, and
I must admit that my wider knowledge of British history is perhaps not as spotless or as intense as my knowledge of Cymru history.
as should be.
I've tried to focus a lot of my recent research on the land specific to me because we weren't taught it. And as much as we were taught how to recite kings and queens and prime ministers and stuff like that, most of that information was not interesting to me at school. So I kind of like lost that information.
I noticed that the similarity between like US and UK imperialism is that they teach you to remember all of these like people and songs and like anthems and stuff to like instill an artificial sense of nationalism. And I'm like, you guys, I was like, this isn't making people loyal. This is making us bored. Do you want us to be bored?
So there is a fantastic children's program which started out as a book series called Horrible Histories. And the reason it was so fun to a lot of children is because it concentrated on the horrible aspects of history, i.e. who was hung, drawn and quartered and all these kind of aspects. And when they turned that into a TV series, they actually created a song which was very, very catchy to teach you all the names of the kings and queens of England since William the Conqueror. And it starts out like William, Henry, and it just keeps going through. And then since the Queen of England died last year, they actually changed the song to include Charles.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I guess that's
a lot of it.
one way.
Yeah. So they did kind of make it funny and attribute funny personalities to aspects of known historical personalities to these kings and queens, which is why it was so catchy.
We don't really get to have fun with history in the US because most of it's very sad.
When you look at the true histories, yes.
Yeah. Like you'll be like, oh, I'm having fun learning this lesson, and then you go Google it out of class and you'll be like, oh.
Yeah. I don't trust US history. Like I don't even think I took history classes in high school from a US standpoint. Like I was already studying much deeper than that.
I was very, very lucky with the way school, like with the time period I grew up, because at one point my state, Oklahoma, was extremely Native friendly, and I guess in my specific area there was some sort of influence on like general education classes, because they would come and like take you to classes to learn your native language if you were Cherokee, which I'm not. But they taught Native language and culture in class for like specifically students of certain tribes, and I was very lucky to learn some things in high school that I don't think a lot of people are taught outside of Oklahoma. And I know Oklahoma has one of the worst educational systems in the United States, but the amount of people who don't like fully grasp what happened to the Native people. There are Cherokee in Oklahoma though. Like one of the main Cherokee groups is in Oklahoma.
There are many Cherokee. There are Cherokee groups in Oklahoma. They're not from Oklahoma, but they're in Oklahoma. I mean, and he didn't say they were from Oklahoma.
I don't remember what I was saying.
You're missing the whole point, Patrick. The whole point. You were talking about being taught the Cherokee language in school. That there were.
No, I wasn't taught it. Some other kids were.
Okay.
But yeah, it was very interesting. We had a lot of people who were openly Native, a lot of teachers who are openly Native, and it was very progressive for its time. And then ever since then, especially with Governor Stitt, who, if I remember correctly, is literally like an enrolled tribal member, maybe, it's gone massively downhill, and like people are not really taught the same things anymore. I think they're still taught the Cherokee language, but like it's gotten to the point where some kids are getting in trouble for wearing aspects of their regalia to graduation, which didn't used to be a problem. Like, and it got to the point where they had to pass a law saying that was okay because of Governor Stitt, and he tried to veto it. Yeah. And he's Native, as far as I remember, or has like a Native family member or something. Like he's connected to the Native community somehow, but like after his election, we all kind of stopped liking and trusting him, which I never did, because any man who associates himself with like Native beliefs that is also an extreme overtly like right-wing Republican is not to be trusted.
Yeah.
I was like, I would not trust him, but I'm gonna let you guys make your decision.
So I do want to answer a couple of things that I saw in, and I think that somebody that I was trying to or that I needed to answer has actually gone now, but I do want to make sure. So the UN does not give a full list of who it considers to be Indigenous. It has a list that is pretty much all Indigenous nations within the US. If you're Googling from the United States, at least, you might get a different answer if you're Googling from somewhere else. I have not found a list other than that one, and it only listed like 15 Indigenous nations in the US. It didn't even list like all of the Indigenous nations. It does state that there are 90 countries out of 195 countries who have Indigenous people within them. And it does state this list down here of what it is to be identified as Indigenous, or how you can identify groups as being Indigenous. So some of the groups that we're speaking to today, even though they are underneath all of these things, are still not being identified by the UN as an Indigenous group. Again, that's colonization and maintaining control over different groups. That list, I do know that there are some times that I Googled that it said that list of who is Indigenous did not include Africa and Asia. I do know that when I Googled like Indigenous people of the African continent, it would give me a couple of different groups. Or if I Googled Indigenous people of the Asian continent, it would give me a couple of different groups. So if you Google by specific continent, you might be able to find specific groups. But it does acknowledge, not in every space that it acknowledges things, but it does acknowledge in some spaces that, in more spaces than not, that Africa and Asia absolutely has Indigenous groups. I do know that like the Khoi people of South Africa are identified as an Indigenous group. And the Ainu people of Asia are identified as an Indigenous group. There are several groups within Russia that are identified as Indigenous groups. Several groups within China. Many who are identified as Indigenous groups, and many groups within China that are identified as Indigenous groups. The Ainu are in Japan. So there are Indigenous groups identified really across the globe. Again, that's 90 out of 195 countries. And I believe it was 5,000 nations is what the identified amount of Indigenous groups is.
So the Yamato people, which is the main ethnicity of Japan, they're actually, if I remember correctly, native to China itself, but they no longer identify as Indigenous. They like got rid of that and formed their own identity, which took a very long time. But there are, I believe, two Indigenous groups within modern day Japan: the Ainu, and then I believe the people of the former Ryukyuan kingdom, the Okinawan people.
That makes sense. It is hard to find a full list. And so I actually did it. I was like, I'll put together a list. Did not work. But you can find some of that information. We are focusing today not only on groups within globally, not within the United States and or not within the North and South American continents, but groups in other continents who are either Indigenous themselves within their space or fighting to be recognized by the UN as Indigenous groups that are actually underneath all of these qualifiers, or the majority of these qualifiers. I am stating that. Yes, love?
Oh, I was going to ask Sleepy Bear a question.
Oh, please do.
Okay, yes.
Why do people ignore evidence of prehistoric Celtic societies within the areas that you now currently occupy? Because, like,
what do you mean specifically? If you can be more specific.
Like evidence of prehistoric settlements, evidence like specific like bodies found that like predate written history. Why do people like ignore the fact that you guys are like that's proof that you guys were pretty much there this entire time?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily ignored. I mean, there is a huge amount of evidence to suggest that there were peoples in this space prior to the Celtic peoples. And that's probably more to do with the changing of weather systems and the migration patterns of people.
Yeah, that's true. But like the Cheddarman's descendants still live.
I can answer that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Widda might be able to
unless you want, yeah. So because Chowderman's descendant is a part of the British people that are there now, which so they ended up. So many people think that it's just a Norman conquest that actually like forms, but that's just the conquest of the government. It's not the conquest of the people. And so when you're looking at the people that were there, they might still be like Chowderman's direct descendants still in that space. But when they unified to form all of England, and they were many different countries already, and they unified to form all of England, that's when, because they're a governing power at that time, it transfers to native as opposed to indigenous, what Scald was talking about earlier. And it also is the group of people who then in turn colonize other spaces like the Comrie, like the Kernwick. And
so the history of the British Isles, what is now Britain, is so vast, and there has been so many invasions, colonizations, and things.
It's mind-boggling to me.
It is. If you look at the space that is specifically England now, which is where Cheddar Man was found, I think in Somerset or Chester, one of the two. Somerset?
I think so.
Yeah. Was it Somerset?
Let me look. I'll look. Go ahead. Finish talking.
Have a look it up. So this is an area that was specifically, that is now considered England. However, it would never have originally been England. It would have been Britain, which was the name of the land mass that is now England, Scotland, Wales.
Somerset.
So, and that was occupied in the southern regions, all the way up into part of the southern part of what is now Scotland, was all Cymric people, which were a type of Brythonic Celtic tribal systems going throughout that. North of that border, you had in the northeast Pictish people, which were Brythonic Celt, which they broke off with their language a little bit sooner than the rest of the Cymry and the Canoic and whatever. And then later on in about the 400s, this is after the Romans, I think it's about the 400s, that's when the Gaels came over into the northwestern part of Scotland. So the Romans were the first to really invade into the lower parts of what is England. And they came in like 43 AD. So that was the first invasion. Now they enslaved and murdered. They enslaved 1 million people. They murdered 1 million people, all which would have been Cymric people, all of my ancestors, all of these people. We were one united people, but living in many peoples and many tribes. We were like the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. They are many people, all with separate identities, but united as one in many ways. If you look at the genetics of people who currently live in England, you will see that technically they have indigenous Cymric blood that runs through their brain, their veins. You know, so they do have that level of indigeneity. However, you have, when the Romans left in the late 400s, you then have the Anglos come in, which is where England gets its name from, is Anglo land. They were the major Germanic peoples that came in and replaced and displaced and took over what was left after the Romans left.
So this is embarrassing, but where were the Anglos from? Because the term now is Anglo-Saxon, but those are two different groups. I know the Saxons are from Saxon.
Yeah, so so technically it was 3 separate groups, I believe, that invaded and joined together. So you had the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, I think it was.
Oh, that makes sense. I'm like 15, like a huge percentage, like Jew, like just direct Jew. I'm like, why is that? You guys have been gone forever. But anyway, yeah, that makes sense.
They're Germanic tribes.
So they were all Germanic tribes that came in and took over. Now, you would have still had some leftover Roman people that had decided to settle in the areas, because after the initial onslaught of, you know, the times of like Boudica and the big battles with the Celtic people and the Romans, there was, I wouldn't say a peaceful period, but there was a period of time where they coexisted, separate and side by side, but still under sort of Roman rule. And then when the Romans left, the only Romans that were left within this landmass were those who decided to stay. And again, you probably see some evidence of this in DNA somewhere. Yeah, the Anglos then came in at like the early 500s or 550s, around about that time, and became the dominant culture here at that point. They're the ones that pushed the Cymry people further back into what is now Cymru, and the Canuic people further back into what is now Cornwall. And this is kind of like, I think, where we start to see the dividing of the language as well, where it divided into its, because they were isolated from each other. What is now Cornwall used to be referred to as West Wales. Now, you might have noticed I call my country Cymru, because that is basically fellow countrymen. That is the word in my language for my country. The word Wales actually comes from Anglo-Saxon language, and it means foreigner or slave.
Oh, jeez.
So, yes, this is why the Welsh football team just changed their name to the Cymru football team. So, yes, buddy?
Yet another case of the colonizer naming people.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want some more chips?
I don't mean to interrupt, but at what point do like what we now consider colonizers, at what point did they like abandon their indigeneity, and is there any way for them to reconnect to that?
Do you mean like the English?
So like obviously they're Germanic tribes.
Right.
They're a tribal group, and like there are many people in France who like have been trying to do stuff related to like the Gallic, like the indigenous Gallic people. But like at what point like did these people stop being indigenous? Was it when they started colonizing others, or was it when they became homogenous? And like
I think that's a really, really interesting question. I would probably err on the side when it started becoming homogenous, and the indigenous cultures that may have existed in that space became more accepting of the cultures that colonized. I think perhaps that's probably a better rounded answer, but the answer is not exactly clear. To say that England has no culture, that's actually quite untrue. There are aspects of traditional culture that I wouldn't necessarily say is English, that derives from the ancient roots of their Celtic ancestors.
Yeah,
for instance,
absolutely.
moss dancing, or moss dancing, is that the word? Morris dancing.
Sorry.
I say it's very similar to like other forms of folk dancing. Here in Cymru, you have clog dancing, which might be with or without handkerchiefs, which is the thing that Morris dancers use alongside bells and stuff. And you know, the Irish obviously have the Irish dancing, and Scottish have Scottish dancing. They're all various forms to various degrees of folk dancing that have been developed into various skills over years. Okay.
Oh. I keep interrupting. I'm so sorry. I get so excited about this topic. One of the like weirdest things in like American folk magic has no like source of origin except the English, and they don't know where it came from in England, so I'm assuming it was very early. But people would put half of a shoe in like the walls when they were like the ceiling when they were building their house. And for like hundreds, even thousands of years, we randomly found these shoes in like ancient buildings. And we're like, what is that there?
That sounds Scandinavian.
Yeah, it's not something I've heard of. I mean, we have a lot of our own traditions and superstitions and stuff, whatever, some crazy stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't put it past them for the English, to be honest.
It's actually an apotropaic charm against like the evil eye, but it's so old that like the actual like definite origin of it is murky at best.
Yeah.
It sounds like it would be Scandinavian. Because the Scandinavians often use their shoes and their shit. Like that's how they do their Kris Kringle, their Santa Claus, basically, is they put out shoes.
I was going to say the only connection I can think of is the old traditions of Sean Corn and Santa Claus. So Sean Corn is the Welsh Santa Claus. You know, you see all throughout like Europe and places like that, and probably Scandinavia as well. They all talk about using stockings and shoes and stuff like that to receive gifts from various traditional Father Christmases.
Yeah, but it's not exactly the same thing. They would like cut a boot or a shoe or like something in half, embed it somewhere in the home, and the thinking was that this would protect them from like witches or spirits. And So there's
So
not really.
if it was a specific against witches, you've got to be talking about early medieval times where they were really starting the witch hunts. If it was specifically to do with witches, but if it was specifically to do with spirits or evil spirits, again, you're probably talking a period of time in early Christianity when the superstitions were at their highest, because early Christianity within Britain, various spaces within Britain, was relatively unique because they tried to tailor Christian practices to the existing practices of the older religions that are practiced throughout various places to make the new religion more acceptable. And that's where a lot of weird practices come from, is through the amalgamation.
Christian occult practices come from, so many.
So, I mean, I know in spaces in Ireland, for instance, their practice of Catholicism, which was the predominant, Christian religion there, is still to this day influenced by pagan traditions that have been thousands of years old. You'll see a very, very different practice of Christianity in some areas, not in all parts, but in some areas of the Christian faith in Ireland than you will see anywhere else in the world. Certain pilgrimages that they do, which were very traditional to do with their Indigenous peoples.
My mother grew up Irish Catholic. They're so unique in the way they Catholicism.
Yeah.
My family actually, we have, St. Brigid's cloth. How they would do stuff to it and leave it out, and it would become blessed and capable of different things. Here in Oklahoma, it's actually an incredibly common practice for families of former Catholics who are now Protestant, or at least say they're Protestant, to have a cloth man come to church and give them a blessed cloth, and we're supposed to utilize it to protect ourselves, cleanse certain things, and pray. And the origin for that isn't even normal Irish Catholicism. It's for folk Catholicism and folk witchcraft.
Yeah. So did you say St. Bridget?
Yeah, the cloth.
Yeah. So Bridget is one of the Irish Celtic goddesses, which was.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
I was like, you guys realize the fact that you're conjuring dreams to Thymos items and telling your children to put this in their sock, and realize you guys are all witches, right? It's not normal it's really normal for you to go up to Christians here and them just being able to tell things about you that are not possible. They can rub their hand on your shoulder and find out that you didn't sleep last night, or tell you that you're going to get the flu in 2 weeks. Everyone here is it's so heavily populated by Irish immigrants that pretty much everyone here had a great grandma who was an Irish witch.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me whether because of the Irish migration into the US diaspora, that the Irish culture in America would have diversified even more to become a specific Irish-American amalgamation.
Yeah, we have Irish-American folk magic pretty prominently here. The Ozark folk magic system is a mix between Cherokee and Irish and a lot of other beliefs. Yeah. And so you will have specific protocols for dealing with Ozark fair folk, who, by the way, are perhaps one of the most aggressive groups of fair folk I have ever heard about, because they will go after you don't have to do anything wrong. They just might not they might just go for your throat.
Are you talking about the Fae?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have a neighbor.
You pretty much across most of the Celtic identities, there is a simple rule: you don't fuck with the Fae.
Yeah.
We have our own names for various different Fae here. Tulworth Taig is probably the closest to a universal kind of.
Oh yeah, those guys are terrifying. I have only encountered one once, and I was like, "Sir, please leave my house."
Well, and most of the Irish things here in America, Irish American things, most people don't realize, they don't celebrate St. Paddy's Day the way that we do, and they don't celebrate. They don't do corned beef and cabbage. That's something that only diaspora Irish did. The Irish themselves, because corned beef.
The closest thing we would have to corned beef and cabbage, we would have potatoes and cabbage, which is like a cold cannon potato, and that would probably be the closest thing you would see. In England, you have a corned beef hash, which is potato and corned beef. Sorry, that I went down a food item.
Oh no, it's
They're a chef.
like here, this is gonna sound so weird, but we like our mix between like in my area, like Germans and like Germanic people and like the Irish will have sauerkraut with sausage.
Oh, I love that. That's one of my favorite things, actually.
That's actually a common thing in like the Germanic region. I can only specifically speak about Austria because I've been there, but sauerkraut and like a bratwurst or bockwurst or something like that is
Yeah. So like the thing in Oklahoma is that no one actually got rid of their culture. They were just all like, yeah, we're definitely Christian. Mm-hmm. And then they like nothing changed. Like they just renamed a bunch of stuff.
This
They're
is
like,
true
it's not
about like
witchcraft.
Welsh identity. Yeah, it's very, very true about Welsh identity. I mean, okay, if you walk out my house, if you walk a mile in any direction, you will probably come across at least 10, if not 15 churches. Wales, Cymru itself is a highly Christianized place, even still. However, when I say it's a highly Christianized place, it is nothing like the US in terms of diversity. You've got some chips and you've got a burger there, and you've got some more chips here. No? There's nothing else, buddy. The shop's shut now.
I'm going to have to leave in like 10 more minutes just so everybody knows I've got an appointment at 2. So I do have to leave in like 10 more minutes.
So, but yeah, although you can have that, although it's not bread, no. You
Baby
can eat
boy
that
is not giving her a chance to speak.
Eat it. Go on. So, yeah, it's not like the US culture of like Christianity at all. I would say that probably it's gluten-free, yes. It's probably, I would say 80 to 90%, no, not even that. I'd say probably at least 50% of people in Cymru will say that they're Christian because their parents were Christian, and because their parents were Christian, therefore they're Christian, but they may not even go to church. They may not even really have these beliefs. It's just something that they fill out on a form.
Yeah.
What is your religious belief? I'm Christian, right? And then you'll have other people that actually do go to church or identify as Christian in that aspect. A good 80% of people will probably be the type of people that will go to church on a Sunday and forget about everything else in the week, and that is good enough for them. So you're only leaving like 10 to 20% of people who are much, much more devout and into it. And even still, of those people, you don't get people like mass crowding places protesting things, and you might, if you go into one of the big cities on a busy Saturday afternoon, find one or two people standing in the middle of the street Bible bashing.
Because we were colonized by the church, and so all of us have like unique experiences relating to the church, and actually because of syncretization, the church is like because of syncretization, that's how some of our practices survived. So we kind of like there's nothing left from before the church. So some of us like we don't really have a choice.
Also, we're not holding a live on natives. We're holding a live on Indigenous people across the globe, and we're not focusing on the Turtle Islands today. We're focusing on other spaces. People like the Sami who are in Scandinavia, and people who are fighting to be recognized by the UN that fall under all of the things of what the UN says is Indigenous people. So we're not talking about the US right now. We're talking about other spaces right now. And so Sleepy is Cymru, and that is a place that is colonized by the English, and they're talking about their experience. Absolutely. No, and that's why I clarified, because I know you. I know that you're...
I got another question. Sleepy, do you, like in Oklahoma, we have this thing where a lot of people, like they said they were Christian and they like gaslit themselves into thinking their like old ways of like life were also Christian. Like they're like, yeah, this is definitely Christian, when if you look like deeply at it, it has nothing to do with Christianity, and it's like an entirely pagan practice. Do you have that where like people have gaslit themselves into thinking that these things?
Oh, absolutely. The thing is, Cymru culture, when you break it down, you've got to break it down into pre kind of like Roman era culture, which is the ancient culture of our societies, which arguably there is very, very little understood or known. Very, very few oral histories remain from that time. Our understanding of the way in which our people lived at that time is still being unearthed and discovered as we're digging up and researching and whatever. There is stories of like, yes, not the bread, not the bread. Burger is, but not the bread. So no, you can't have that. That's Mummy's burger. So there are stories of like, you know, there being a lot of ancient writings that are stored in. That is gluten, Bear. It is gluten. You cannot eat that. That's going to make you sick.
Oh, not the gluten allergy.
Yeah, I don't normally eat it. It's just it was quick and easy tonight. But yeah, like there are stories of like the existence of manuscripts and writings from our ancient societies. Bear, have some water. Oh, there is no water. Let me go get some water. I drank it all. Bad mummy. But you know, manuscripts existing in spaces like within Ireland, because Ireland is most untouched by. It's not untouched, but that's the wrong word to use. But it's less untouched. It's less touched by everything because it's a little island. So they have the ability to store and preserve a lot more of the culture and identity that they had than those of us that lived on the mainland. So that's kind of like, you know, explains why Celtic is seen as synonymous, because we have more knowledge about Irish culture. But the stories go that these writings are in existence that will actually help unlock our identity and unlock the histories. However, they're all written in like ancient Irish writings, which very few people understand. So, and working through that's going to take years and years. What was the original question? Oh yeah, Christianization. So you have like the ancient aspect to our traditions and culture, but then we have some like older traditions, which, although are very, very old, they're not like from the ancient part of our society. Now they might have some tedious links to ancient society because all traditions are born out of something.
What do you mean by tedious links? Because I feel like your definition is different than the word here.
So when I say tedious, I mean links that may not necessarily hold up to the societal standard of accepted history.
I think they mean tenuous.
Tenuous.
Yeah.
Probably. Sorry, wrong word then.
Tedious is when something annoys you.
It does annoy me as well.
Well, yeah.
So, I see you. So there are a lot of traditions. I'm watching you, darling. There are a lot of traditions that are influenced and adulterated and watered down by Christian impact, that have become traditional and definitely part of Welsh culture, and no less enjoyed by, you know, Welsh identity, but not necessarily 100% linked to ancient societies. But you will see a lot of Christianity that has been adulterated to fit the society around in which it's trying to infiltrate, but you'll also see vice versa. There's almost like a sharing of culture in that aspect.
I am going to stop us here. Thank you so much, Sleepy, for everything that you gave us.
So much.
Augusta, thank you for coming up and asking so many good questions and providing an American thought process to ask these questions that I might not have been able to ask so many different things of, or might not have seen in these different lights to ask. And so thank you both so much for coming up and speaking. It may stay up for a little bit after I leave. I've heard that. But I will do this again. We'll hold space for Indigenous people in other areas, as you know, across the globe as well. Again, and of course, we'll be holding more space for Indigenous people here in Turtle Island as well. But thank you so much for sharing, you know, your struggle, and for asking questions or answering questions, and for the labor of love that this is, just like it was for Scald. Like, I really appreciate you guys doing this labor of love of teaching people. And to everybody else who came in today, thank you so much. We'll be doing something like this again. Sleepy and I have done this before, and we've decided we need to do a few more of these just to give a little bit more understanding. Of course, again, we'll go back to also our paleoanthropology and the different things that we do around here again.
Hi, Kitty.
Have such a great day, and I will be back tomorrow. I can't tell you which time. And Little Bear, you have a great day too, and you take care of Mama, okay? You take care of Mama for me, Little Bear? Hi. Thanks, everybody. Have such a great afternoon. And again, it might stay up for a little bit after I leave.
Bye, Widda.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Perfection.
Last year, this ended up causing me to learn.
YouTube, thank you so much for coming in and sitting with us. I know that it's not as easy in YouTube to see who's talking and everything else, and so it kind of makes it a little bit harder, but I really, really appreciate you guys coming over and sitting on YouTube and listening. We will again go live on this again, just like again, we'll go live on Indigenous Turtle Island issues. And make sure that we're pushing all of that to the forefront, because again, land back everywhere is land back for everybody, right? And it can't be in just one space for it to really help us change what we need to change. Much love, and I will be back tomorrow. Have a great one.